The summer of 1983 hit upstate New York like a fever dream. I'm Tyson, by the way. College dropout, professional couch surfer, and accidental witness to events that still haunt my nightmares. This is my story, told as best as I can remember it, though some details might be hazy through the lens of time and trauma. It all started when my landlord kicked me out for what he called excessive revelry. Translation: I threw one too many parties. Rather than crawl back to my parents with my tail between my legs, I decided to rely on the kindness of friends and relatives. That's how I ended up crashing at my cousin Ryan's place, a rickety apartment above a garage on the outskirts of a sleepy town near the Finger Lakes. Ryan shared the place with his roommate, Zach. The apartment wasn't much to look at, cramped with mismatched furniture and a perpetual smell of stale pizza, but it was a roof over my head. Zach was an easygoing guy with shaggy hair and a permanent half smile, looking like he'd be more at home on a California beach than in the rural Northeast. I tried to keep a low profile, mostly staying out of their way and contributing what I could to groceries and beer runs. But as the days stretched into weeks, I found myself getting restless. There's only so much daytime TV a guy can watch before he starts to lose his mind. One Friday night in late July, Ryan and Zach headed out to some party in town, leaving me alone with my thoughts and their well-stocked fridge. I cracked open a beer and settled in with a dog-eared paperback, determined to make some headway on my ever-growing to-read pile. 3 beers in, that's when I first heard it: music. Not the tinny sounds from a neighbor's radio, but deep, pulsing beats that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I glanced at the clock, just past midnight. The sound was coming from the direction of the old barn behind the house, a dilapidated structure I'd barely given a second glance to before. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed another beer and ventured outside. The night air was thick and humid, fireflies blinking lazily in the darkness. As I approached the barn, the music grew louder, a heavy bass line underscored by something that sounded almost like chanting. It was eerie, out of place in the quiet countryside. I pushed open the barn door, expecting to find Ryan and Zach had decided to throw an impromptu party. Instead, I stepped into a nightmare. The interior of the barn had been transformed. Strobe lights cut through the darkness, casting everything in sharp, disorienting flashes. A handful of people swayed on what looked like a makeshift dance floor, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, alcohol, and something else, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. But it was what hung from the rafters that made my blood run cold. At first I thought it was some kind of grotesque Halloween decoration, but as my eyes adjusted to the strobing lights, I realized with mounting horror that it was a body. A man, suspended upside down, his skin a ghastly shade of white, and he'd been mutilated. Chunks of flesh were missing, as if something had been feeding on him. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sick joke, a hallucination brought on by bad beer or, God forbid, something slipped into my drink. I turned to run, to find Ryan or Zach, to call the cops, to do anything but stand there staring at that horrific scene. In my panic, I tripped over a discarded beer can. The clatter seemed deafening in the sudden silence. The music had stopped. Slowly, I looked up, and that's when I saw him. He stood in the doorway, blocking my escape, tall and gaunt, wearing only a pair of tattered jeans. His bare chest was covered in what looked like dried blood, and even in the dim light, his eyes gleamed with an inhuman hunger. When he spoke, his voice was a low, guttural rasp that sent shivers down my spine. "Well, well," he said, taking a step towards me. "Looks like we've got ourselves an uninvited guest." I scrambled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse with fear. "Somebody help me!" But who would hear me out here, miles from the nearest neighbor? The man, if you could call him that, advanced steadily, unhurried, like a predator confident its prey had nowhere to run. I could see his hands now, fingers tipped with long, filthy nails reaching for me. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die, torn apart in a dirty barn in the middle of nowhere. My mind raced with images of newspaper headlines. College dropout found mutilated. Gruesome discovery in quiet country town. Just as I was sure it was all over, I heard a shout from behind me. "Ty, what the hell are you doing out here?" It was Ryan and Zach bursting into the barn. Ryan's question died on his lips as he took in the scene. The flashing lights, the dazed partiers, and the horrific shape hanging from the rafters. The creature whirled around, momentarily distracted. Zach, bless his stoner heart, didn't hesitate. He grabbed a rusty pitchfork leaning against the wall and charged, forcing the thing backward. Seizing my chance, I scrambled to my feet. My legs felt like jelly, but adrenaline propelled me forward. I staggered past Ryan, who was yelling something I couldn't make out over the roaring in my ears. I ran blindly through the darkness, back towards the house, tears streaming down my face. "Don't look back, don't look back," I chanted to myself as I sprinted across the overgrown yard. I reached the porch and pounded frantically on the door, screaming for someone, anyone, to let me in. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the lock click. I burst inside and collapsed on the couch, great heaving sobs racking my body. A few minutes later, Ryan and Zach appeared, both pale and wide-eyed. "Where'd he go?" I managed to gasp out between ragged breaths. "Did you get him?" Ryan shook his head grimly. "We lost him in the trees," he said, glancing nervously out the window as if expecting the creature to materialize out of the darkness. "Who the hell was that, Ty? Why did he have I don't know," I choked out. "I just heard the music and—" It took a while for me to calm down enough to explain everything I'd seen. Ryan called the cops, his voice shaking as he tried to describe the situation. When they finally arrived, they took our statements and examined the barn. But the body was gone, vanished without a trace. They searched the surrounding woods but found nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, not even footprints. The cops didn't really seem to believe us. I could see it in their eyes, the way they exchanged skeptical glances. They probably figured we were just some kids tripping on drugs, imagining horrors in the dark. They warned us about the dangers of underage drinking and left, promising to keep an eye on the area. The next day, we scoured the woods ourselves, desperate for some proof that what we'd seen was real. But there was nothing. No mysterious stranger, no mutilated body, not even any sign of the makeshift dance floor or strobe lights in the barn. It was as if the whole nightmare had been a shared hallucination. Except I found something. A single beer can, lying in the spot where I'd stumbled upon the creature. It was the same brand I'd been drinking that night. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Ryan and Zach were shaken, but as time passed, I could see them starting to doubt their own memories. Maybe it had just been a bad trip, they reasoned. Maybe we'd all drunk something funny and imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I'd seen. The image of that body hanging from the rafters was burned into my brain, impossible to forget or explain away. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something dark and dangerous, something that wasn't finished with us yet. I started having nightmares, vivid dreams where I was running through endless dark woods, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel breathing down my neck. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, sheets tangled around me, the echo of inhuman laughter ringing in my ears. Ryan and Zach tried to be supportive, but I could tell my growing paranoia was starting to wear on them. I insisted on keeping all the doors and windows locked, even in the stifling summer heat. I'd jump at every unexpected sound, convinced that the creature from the barn had come back to finish what it started. About a week after that night, strange things started happening around the apartment. We'd wake up to find the fridge door open, food strewn across the floor as if something had been rummaging through it in the night. Scratching sounds came from the walls, too loud to be mice. Once, I could have sworn I saw a pair of glowing eyes peering in through the bedroom window, but when I looked again, they were gone. Ryan and Zach wrote it off as the product of an overactive imagination, fueled by too many late-night horror movies. But I knew better. Something was out there, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I started doing research, spending hours at the local library poring over old newspapers and town records. I was looking for anything, missing persons reports, unsolved murders, local legends, that might shed some light on what we'd encountered. What I found chilled me to the bone. Over the past few decades, there had been a string of disappearances in the area. Young people, mostly. Hikers, campers, the occasional drifter passing through town. The official reports chalked it up to the dangers of the wilderness or runaways seeking a fresh start. But reading between the lines, I started to see a pattern. Many of the disappearances had happened around the full moon. Witnesses reported strange lights in the woods or eerie music carried on the wind, and in a few cases, remains had been found, but they were always incomplete, as if something had been feeding on the bodies. I tried to share my findings with Ryan and Zach, but they didn't want to hear it. They were doing their best to pretend that night had never happened, throwing themselves into their jobs and social lives with a kind of desperate energy. But I couldn't let it go. I knew that ignoring the danger wouldn't make it go away. As the next full moon approached, the atmosphere in the apartment grew tense. Ryan and Zach thought I was losing my mind, but they humored me by agreeing to stay in that night. We stocked up on food and beer, planning to hunker down and have a movie marathon. But as darkness fell, the power went out. One minute we were arguing over which cheesy 80s action flick to watch first, and the next we were plunged into darkness. I fumbled for a flashlight, my heart racing. This was it, I thought. It was coming for us. We huddled together in the living room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house settling. Hours passed and nothing happened. Just as we were starting to relax, thinking maybe it had been a false alarm, we heard it. Music drifting up from the direction of the barn. The same pulsing, hypnotic beat we'd heard that night. Ryan and Zach exchanged worried glances. They couldn't deny it now. Something was out there. "We should call the cops," Zach said, reaching for the phone. But the line was dead. "Maybe we should just ignore it," Ryan suggested, his voice shaky. "Stay here where it's safe." But I knew we couldn't hide forever. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to just go away. We had to face it, had to find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. "We need to go out there," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "We need to finish this." Ryan and Zach looked at me like I was crazy, but deep down, I think they knew I was right. Arming ourselves with whatever makeshift weapons we could find, kitchen knives, a baseball bat, Zach's prized guitar, we stepped out into the night. The music grew louder as we approached the barn, joined now by the sound of voices, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The door stood open, warm light spilling out into the darkness. Taking a deep breath, we stepped inside. What we found there defied explanation. The interior of the barn had been transformed into something alien and terrifying. Strange symbols covered the walls, glowing with an inner light. A group of robed figures stood in a circle, swaying in time with the otherworldly music. And in the center of it all stood the creature from that night, the gaunt, blood-covered thing that had haunted my nightmares. But now I could see it clearly, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't entirely human. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. It turned to look at us, a cruel smile spreading across its face. "Welcome," it said, its voice somehow inside my head rather than coming from its mouth. "We've been waiting for you." What happened next was a blur of violence and terror. We fought with everything we had, driven by desperation and the primal need to survive. I remember the clash of metal, the sickening crunch of bone, inhuman shrieks of pain and rage. In the end, we managed to drive them back, the creature and its robed followers fleeing into the night. We burned the barn to the ground. hoping to destroy whatever dark magic had taken root there. As we stood watching the flames, exhausted and bloodied but alive, I knew that our lives would never be the same. We had glimpsed a world beyond our understanding, a realm of darkness and hunger that existed alongside our own. In the years since that night, I have dedicated my life to uncovering the truth about what we encountered. Ryan and Zach have tried to move on, to forget what happened. But I can't let it go. I know that somewhere out there in the shadows of our world, that creature is still waiting, and I'll be ready when it comes back. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, God knows there are days I wish I could convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I know that the night is full of terrors most people couldn't even begin to imagine. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. Be careful out there. And if you ever hear strange music coming from an abandoned barn in the middle of the night, run, and don't look back. It was mid-July when I decided to take a break from my hectic life as a freelance writer in the city. The constant deadlines and looming writer's block had been weighing heavily on me, and I figured a weekend getaway would do me some good. My destination? Lake Laconic, a secluded spot I'd heard about from a fellow writer at a coffee shop. He'd raved about its tranquility and how it was the perfect place to recharge and find inspiration. I packed up my trusty RV, making sure to bring along my loyal companion, Cooper, a golden retriever who'd been by my side through thick and thin. As we set off early Friday morning, the excitement was palpable. Cooper sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, tongue lolling in the wind. His joy was infectious, and I found myself grinning as we wound our way out of the city. The journey to Lake Laconic took us through a gradual transition from urban sprawl to rolling countryside. Concrete and glass gave way to fields and forests, and the air seemed to get fresher with each mile. We stopped at a small diner for lunch, where I treated myself to a hearty burger and shared a few fries with Cooper. The elderly waitress, noticing my RV, asked where we were headed. "Lake Laconic," I replied, wiping my mouth with a napkin. Her smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, that's nice. Beautiful place. Just be careful out there, you hear? Nature can be unpredictable." I nodded, chalking up her concern to the typical worries of small-town folks about city dwellers in the wilderness. If only I'd paid more attention to the weight behind her words. As we approached the lake in the late afternoon, the sun was already beginning its descent, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. The lake itself was a mirror, reflecting the sky's colors and the silhouettes of the surrounding pines. It was breathtaking, and for a moment I forgot all about my writing woes and looming deadlines. I found a secluded spot to park the RV, about 50 yards from the shoreline. It was perfect, close enough to the water for easy access, but far enough back to give us some privacy. As I set up our campsite, I noticed an old pickup truck parked about 100 yards away, partially hidden by a cluster of trees. The truck looked like it had seen better days. Its once red paint was now a patchwork of rust and faded color, and the tires seemed to be slowly sinking into the soft earth. It struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Probably belonged to some old-timer who used the lake as his private fishing spot. With the RV parked and leveled, I set up my folding chair by the water's edge. Cooper sprawled out beside me, his tail thumping contentedly against the ground. I cracked open a cold beer from the cooler and took a long, satisfying swig. The stress of the city seemed to melt away with each passing moment. As darkness fell, I lit a small campfire and roasted some hot dogs for dinner. Cooper got his share too, of course. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets chirping, no frogs croaking, just the occasional pop and crackle from the fire. It should have been peaceful, but something about the silence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the beauty of the night, The moon was nearly full, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. Long shadows stretched across the ground, and the trees on the far side of the lake looked like dark sentinels standing guard. It was the kind of scene that usually sparked my creativity, but tonight it just felt off. After dinner, I decided to take a walk around the area, partly to work off the hot dogs and partly to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the lakeshore, with Cooper trotting along beside me. As we walked, I noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the mud near the water's edge. They were large, much bigger than my own, and they seemed to have an odd gait. The stride was too long for a normal person, and the imprints were deep, as if made by someone or something very heavy. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the trail. It led away from the lake and towards the old pickup truck I'd noticed earlier. As we got closer, I saw a faint light coming from inside the truck's cab. My heart began to race. Someone was in there. I crept closer, trying to stay quiet. Cooper, sensing my tension, remained silent at my side. When I reached the truck, I peered through the cracked rear window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man was hunched over in the back seat, surrounded by piles of ratty clothes and empty food cans. He was muttering to himself, his hands moving frantically as if searching for something. In the dim light of a battery-powered lantern, I could see that his clothes were torn and filthy, his hair a matted mess. I backed away slowly, not wanting to alert him to my presence. But as I turned to leave, I heard his mutterings more clearly. The words were still indistinct, but the tone sent shivers down my spine. It was a mix of fear and anger, punctuated by what sounded like quiet sobs. Cooper and I hurried back to the RV. Once inside, I locked the door and pulled down all the shades. My mind was racing. Who was that man? Why was he living in that old truck? Was he dangerous? I turned on the small TV, hoping the noise would drown out my thoughts and calm my nerves. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of leaves outside, had me on edge. I kept expecting to hear footsteps approaching, or see a shadowy figure peering through the windows. Cooper seemed to sense my unease, staying close by my side instead of curling up in his usual spot. As dawn broke, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The soft light filtering through the RV's curtains seemed to chase away some of the previous night's fears. I made a strong pot of coffee and stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The lake was beautiful in the early light, mist rising off its surface like something out of a painting. For a moment, I could almost forget the unsettling events of the night before. Almost. I decided to stay another night, partly out of stubbornness. I wasn't going to let one creepy encounter ruin my weekend, and partly because I was too tired to face the long drive back to the city. I spent the morning writing, finding that the lingering unease actually fueled my creativity. Words flowed onto the page, a dark and brooding story taking shape. As the day wore on, I found myself constantly glancing towards the old pickup truck. It sat there, seemingly abandoned, showing no signs of its nighttime occupant. Part of me wanted to investigate further, to try and make sense of what I'd seen. But a stronger, more sensible part kept me rooted to the safety of my campsite. The second night started much like the first. I built a fire, cooked a simple dinner, and tried to relax. But the silence seemed even more oppressive than before. The darkness beyond the circle of firelight felt alive, watching, waiting. I kept Cooper close, grateful for his warm, solid presence. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it, a soft, hesitant knock on the RV door. My heart leaped into my throat. Cooper was instantly alert, his ears perked and a low growl rumbling in his chest. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight I kept by the bed, it could serve as a weapon if needed, and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response came, just another knock, more insistent this time. I said, "Who's there?" I repeated, louder now. Finally, a voice answered, weak, raspy, barely above a whisper. "Please, help me." I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Everything in me screamed that this was a bad idea, that I should call the police or simply drive away. But something in that voice, the raw desperation, made me pause. Slowly, I cracked open the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. The man from the truck stood there, looking even more haggard up close. His eyes were wild, darting back and forth, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "What do you want?" I asked, still not opening the door fully. "Please," he repeated, his voice shaking. "Someone's after me. He's going to kill me. I need help." I weighed my options quickly. We were miles from the nearest town, and cell reception out here was spotty at best. Even if I called the police, it could be hours before they arrived. And if this man was truly in danger, against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and opened the door. "Come in," I said, stepping back to let him enter. "But I'm warning you, any funny business and you're out. Got it?" He nodded frantically and stumbled inside. I directed him to sit at the small table while I fetched a bottle of water from the fridge. Cooper positioned himself between me and the stranger, his normally friendly demeanor replaced by watchful caution. "What's your name?" I asked as I handed him the water. He gulped it down before answering. "Martin, my name's Martin." "Okay, Martin. Tell me what's going on. Who's after you?" Martin's hands shook as he set down the empty bottle. "I was hiking through the forest a few days ago when I came across this old cabin. It was raining, so I thought I'd take shelter inside. I thought it was abandoned, but—" He trailed off, his eyes going distant. "But what?" I prompted. "There was someone living there, a man. He wasn't right in the head. When he found me, he went berserk, started screaming about trespassers and thieves. He had a knife." Martin's hand unconsciously went to his side, and I noticed a dark stain on his shirt that I hadn't seen before. "Jesus," I muttered. "Did you go to the police?" Martin shook his head vehemently. "I tried, but he followed me. He knows these woods better than anyone. Every time I thought I'd lost him, he'd show up again. I've been running for days. When I saw your RV, I hoped." Just then, a loud bang resonated through the RV, like something heavy hitting the side. Cooper erupted into furious barking, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "Stay here," I told Martin, grabbing my flashlight and the hunting knife I kept in a kitchen drawer. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The night air was cold, raising goosebumps on my skin. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to create moving shadows at the edge of my vision. I swept the flashlight beam across the clearing, seeing nothing out of place. I was about to head back inside when a low, menacing voice spoke from the darkness. "Where is he?" I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, a man, tall and powerfully built. His face was hidden in the shadow of a hood, but I could see the glint of moonlight on the blade of a knife in his hand. "Get out of here!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Leave us alone!" The man took a step forward. "Give me the little rat and I'll go. Otherwise—" He left the threat hanging in the air. I knew in that moment that there was no reasoning with this man. Whatever had happened between him and Martin, it had pushed him beyond the limits of sanity. I had to protect myself and the terrified man in my RV. I backed towards the door, keeping the flashlight trained on the intruder. Just as my hand found the handle, the man lunged forward with surprising speed. His knife slashed through the air where I had been standing a second before. Instinct took over. I swung the heavy flashlight with all my might, connecting with the side of his head. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. I used that precious moment to dive into the RV, slamming and locking the door behind me. "We need to get out of here now!" I yelled to Martin, who was cowering in the corner. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life just as the man outside began pounding on the door, trying to force his way in. I threw the RV into drive and stomped on the gas. We lurched forward, tires spinning in the soft earth before finding purchase. The attackers' enraged shouts faded as we sped away from the campsite, deeper into the forest on the narrow access road. The next few hours were a blur of dark trees and winding roads. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every bend in the road a potential ambush. Martin sat silently in the passenger seat, jumping at every noise. Cooper paced restlessly in the back, still on high alert. As we drove, Martin slowly began to open up. He told me more about the cabin, about the strange symbols carved into its walls and the bizarre altar he'd found inside. The man who lived there, Martin said, spoke of old gods and ancient rituals. It all sounded like the ravings of a madman, but after what we'd just experienced, I wasn't so quick to dismiss it. Finally, we emerged from the forest and found ourselves on a main road. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a small town in the distance. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the bright fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the darkness we'd just escaped. "Wait here," I told Martin. I went inside, explained the situation to the startled waitress, and used the phone to call 911. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. I recounted the whole story to the officers: the footprints by the lake, the man in the truck, the attack at the RV. They took Martin into custody, assuring me they would get him the medical and psychological help he clearly needed. As I watched them drive away, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The ordeal was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly finished. The attacker's face, hidden by that hood, haunted my thoughts. He was still out there somewhere, in those dark woods, waiting. I spent the rest of the night in the RV, parked under the bright lights of the diner. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Cooper stayed by my side, a constant, comforting presence. As the first light of dawn broke through the darkness, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to my normal life, not yet. The shadow of that night loomed too large. I needed time to process, to heal. I packed up the RV, made sure we had enough supplies, and set off down the highway. I had no destination in mind, just a need to keep moving, to put distance between myself and Lake Laconic. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, I could find peace again. But for now, all I could do was keep driving, keep fighting the memories, and hope that somewhere down this long road, I would find the solace I so desperately sought. Days turned into weeks as Cooper and I crisscrossed the country. We stayed in campgrounds and RV parks, never lingering too long in one place. I tried to write, to make sense of what had happened through my words, but the story remained stubbornly elusive. One evening, about a month after the incident at Lake Laconic, we pulled into a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and strangers stick out like sore thumbs. I needed to resupply, so I parked the RV at a local campground and walked into town, leaving Cooper to guard our temporary home. The general store was a throwback to another era, with creaky wooden floors and shelves stocked with a mishmash of essentials and knickknacks. As I gathered my supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The elderly shopkeeper kept glancing my way, her brow furrowed in concern. When I approached the counter to pay, she leaned in close. "You've seen something, haven't you?" she whispered, her eyes searching mine. "Something you can't explain." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I don't know what you mean," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head slowly. "I've seen that look before. The haunted eyes, the way you keep checking over your shoulder. You're not the first to come through here running from the darkness." I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off and walk away, but something in her voice, in the knowing look in her eyes, made me pause. "What do you know about it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The shopkeeper glanced around, ensuring we were alone. "Not here," she said. "Come by my house after closing, 412 Maple Street. We have much to discuss." I left the store with more questions than answers, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to ignore her invitation, to get back in the RV and keep driving. But a larger part, the part that had been seeking answers since that night at Lake Laconic, knew I had to go. As the sun set, I made my way to 412 Maple Street, a small, well-kept bungalow with a porch swing and flower boxes in the windows. The shopkeeper, who introduced herself as Ruth, ushered me inside. Her living room was cozy, filled with books and old photographs. She gestured for me to sit and disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Now," she said, settling into an armchair across from me, "tell me what you saw." I hesitated at first, but once I started talking, it all came pouring out. The strange tracks by the lake, the man in the truck, the attacker with the knife. Ruth listened intently, nodding occasionally, her expression grave. When I finished, she set down her mug and leaned forward. "What you encountered," she said, her voice low and serious, "is something that's been haunting these parts for generations. Some call it a Wendigo, others a skinwalker. The names change, but the terror remains the same." She went on to tell me stories, tales passed down through her family for generations, of creatures that lurked in the deep woods, of people who went missing and were never found, of rituals and sacrifices meant to appease ancient hungry gods. "But why me?" I asked, my hands shaking as I clutched my mug. "Why did I get caught up in all this?" Ruth's eyes softened with sympathy. "Sometimes we don't choose the darkness, it chooses us. But now that you've seen it, you have a choice to make. You can keep running, always looking over your shoulder, or you can face it." "Face it?" I repeated, incredulous. "How am I supposed to face something like that?" She stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out an old, leather-bound volume. "Knowledge is power," she said, handing me the book. "This contains lore gathered by those who faced the darkness before. Study it, understand it. It might just save your life." I left Ruth's house that night with the book tucked under my arm and a mix of fear and determination in my heart. Over the next few weeks, I pored over its pages, learning about protective symbols, purification rituals, and ways to ward off evil. As I read, I began to write again. The story that had eluded me for so long finally started to take shape. It wasn't just about that night at Lake Laconic anymore. It was about the thin veil between our world and what lurks beyond, about the courage it takes to face the unknown. Months passed. I kept moving, but now with purpose. I sought out others who had encountered the darkness, collecting their stories, piecing together a larger picture. Cooper remained my constant companion, his presence a comforting reminder of normalcy in a world that had become anything but normal. It was a year to the day after the incident at Lake Laconic when I felt the pull to return. The drive back was tense, every mile bringing back memories I'd tried to suppress. But I knew I had to face this, to confront the shadows that had been haunting me. As I parked the RV in the same spot as before, I felt a sense of déjà vu. The lake was as beautiful as ever, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues. But now I knew what lurked beneath the surface of this seeming tranquility. That night, as darkness fell, I sat outside the RV, Ruth's book open on my lap, protective charms around my neck. Cooper lay at my feet, alert but calm. We waited. Hours passed. The moon rose high in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. And then, just as it had a year ago, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. My heart raced, but I stood my ground. The figure emerged from the shadows, tall, menacing, just as I remembered. But this time, I was prepared. As it approached, I began to recite the words I'd memorized from Ruth's book, ancient phrases of protection and banishment. The creature hesitated, then let out a bone-chilling howl. For a moment I thought I'd failed, that this was the end. But then, before my eyes, the creature began to change. It writhed and twisted, its form becoming less solid, more like smoke in the wind. With a final unearthly shriek, it dissipated, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in its wake. I stood there, breathing heavily, Cooper pressed against my leg. It was over. The shadow that had haunted me for so long was gone. As dawn broke, I packed up the RV one last time. But now, instead of running, I was moving forward. I had a story to tell, a warning to share. The darkness was real, but so was the light. And sometimes facing your fears is the only way to truly banish them. My name is Michael Mike Anderson, and what I'm about to share happened during the summer of 1987. Back then, I was working as a counselor at Camp Pine Ridge, sprawled across 20 acres of pristine Wisconsin wilderness about 50 miles north of Madison. I was 20 years old, halfway through college at UW-Milwaukee, looking for a summer job that would put some money in my pocket and keep me outdoors. The camp director, Stephen Mitchell, had been my high school debate team captain 3 years earlier, and when he mentioned they needed counselors, it seemed perfect. Watch some kids, lead some activities, spend my evenings around a campfire. How hard could it be? That naive thought still makes me laugh, though it's a bitter kind of humor these days. Pine Ridge wasn't one of those fancy camps with air-conditioned cabins and heated pools. It was old school, the kind of place where the main lodge dated back to the 1940s, and the cabins still had their original wood paneling, worn smooth by generations of summer campers. The place had character, from the creaky floorboards in the mess hall to the ancient canoes stacked behind the boathouse. There was even a totem pole near the main fire pit, its faces weathered by decades of Wisconsin winters. Our staff that summer started out as a dozen of us, though by August we'd be down to half that number. Tony Big T Kowalski was our maintenance supervisor, a former Chicago cop who'd retired early after taking a bullet in the leg. He walked with a slight limp, but could still outwork most of us half his age. His policy was to fix everything with either duct tape or WD-40, and somehow it always worked. The kids loved him because he snuck them extra desserts and knew 1,000 bad jokes that never failed to make them groan laugh. Rachel Park was our camp nurse, doing her last summer job before starting her residency at Mayo Clinic. She had this quiet way about her that could calm even the most hysterical homesick kid, and hands so steady she could pull out a splinter without you feeling it. She'd grown up in Minnesota and knew every plant in the forest, which ones could help with a bee sting and which ones to avoid like poison. Stephen Mitchell ran the place with a mix of enthusiasm and military precision that came from spending his teenage years as both a camp counselor and in JROTC. At 25, he was young for a camp director, but he made up for it with an encyclopedic knowledge of camp operations and genuine love for the place. He'd even turned down a promising job at an accounting firm to take over when the previous director retired. The rest of the staff were college students like me, eager, energetic, and mostly clueless about what we were really getting into. Jenny O'Connor taught swimming and could do a perfect dive from the high board. Marcus Williams ran the archery range and spent his free time writing what he swore would be the next great American novel. Sarah Chen handled arts and crafts, turning popsicle sticks and yarn into projects that actually looked good enough to keep. That first month was everything summer camp should be. Our days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Wake-up bell at 7 a.m., breakfast by 7:30, morning activities from 9 o'clock to noon, lunch, rest period, afternoon activities until 4 o'clock, free time, dinner at 6 o'clock, evening activities, and lights out at 9:30 for the younger kids, 10 o'clock for the teens. We dealt with the usual stuff: homesickness, scraped knees, cabin rivalries, first crushes, and the occasional escape attempt by some kid who'd decided they'd had enough of camp life. Looking back now, those simple problems feel like a dream compared to what was coming. But that's how horror stories work, don't they? They start with ordinary days, with normal people doing normal things. The darkness creeps in so gradually you don't notice it until it's too late. The first sign that something was wrong came in early July, though none of us recognized it at the time. Kevin Zhang, one of our 15-year-old campers, started talking about seeing strange lights in the woods at night. Kevin wasn't the type to make up stories. He was one of those quietly brilliant kids who spent most of his time reading or sketching in a worn notebook. His drawings were remarkable, detailed sketches of the camp and the surrounding forest that captured not just what things looked like, but somehow how they felt. "There's someone out there," he told me one evening during the camp talent show while other kids were performing a skit on stage. "I see their light moving through the trees at night like an old lantern." I assured him it was probably just the security lights we'd installed along the main paths, or maybe one of the counselors doing their nightly rounds. But Kevin shook his head. "It's different," he insisted. "It moves like it's looking for something, or someone." I should have paid more attention to Kevin's warning, but at the time, I was more concerned with managing the day-to-day chaos of camp life. We had a full roster that summer, 78 kids divided among 12 cabins. Every day brought new challenges: a fight over a missing comic book, a case of poison ivy from an unauthorized wilderness expedition, 2 kids caught trying to mail themselves home in cardboard boxes. The incident with the lights wasn't the only strange thing Kevin noticed. His sketchbook started filling with darker images: twisted trees with faces in their bark, shadowy figures lurking at the edges of the camp, and one recurring image of a tall, skeletal man holding an old railroad lantern. When Rachel saw the drawings during an art therapy session, she mentioned them to Stephen. He brushed it off as an overactive imagination. But looking back, I wonder if Kevin somehow sensed what was coming. July 12th started like any other day. The morning was clear and cool, perfect for the hiking expedition Big T was leading to Eagle Point, the highest spot overlooking the lake. Kevin was supposed to go, but complained of a headache at breakfast. Rachel checked him over and said he could stay back, maybe help Sarah with the younger kids' craft project. That was the last time any of us saw him. The first alarm went up at lunch when Kevin didn't show for his kitchen duty shift. Sarah said he'd left the craft cabin around 10:30, mentioning something about getting his medication from his cabin. His bunkmate, Drew Patterson, hadn't seen him since breakfast. We initiated the missing camper protocol. Every building searched, every bathroom checked, every possible hiding spot investigated. Nothing. By dinner time, the state police were involved. They brought dogs that tracked Kevin's scent from the craft cabin to his bunk in Cedar Lodge, then to the path leading toward the lake. The trail ended abruptly at the water's edge. The initial theory was that he might have gone swimming alone and drowned, but the lake patrol found nothing. It was as if Kevin had simply vanished into thin air. The disappearance hit the camp hard. Stephen spent hours on the phone with Kevin's parents, the police, and the camp's insurance company. We doubled our security measures: buddy system for everything, hourly head counts, increased staff patrols. Some parents pulled their kids out, but most stayed, perhaps believing it was an isolated incident. Then Amanda Taylor disappeared. It happened exactly 1 week after Kevin, during the night of July 19th. Amanda was 13, a first-time camper from Iowa who'd won her spot at Pine Ridge through a school essay contest. Unlike Kevin's daytime vanishing, Amanda's disappearance had witnesses. Sort of. Her cabin mates in Birch Lodge reported hearing footsteps outside their window around midnight, followed by what they described as a weird glowing light. They thought it was just Big T doing his security rounds. It wasn't until morning count that they realized Amanda's bed hadn't been slept in. The second disappearance caused panic. Parents descended on the camp like a swarm, and within 3 days, our population had dropped to 32 campers. The local news vans arrived, parking along the access road and trying to interview anyone who walked past. The state police established a permanent presence, with officers patrolling the grounds 24/7. They brought in FBI consultants who specialized in child abductions. Everyone had a theory: serial killer, human trafficking ring, runaway pact, but no one had any real answers. The remaining staff tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the kids who stayed, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The woods that had once seemed mysterious and exciting now felt threatening. Every shadow could hide a predator. Every unexpected sound caused kids to jump. We canceled all-night activities and implemented a strict dusk curfew. The evening campfire stories, once filled with silly ghost tales and urban legends, were replaced with sing-alongs and puppet shows. Anything to keep the kids' minds off what might be lurking in the darkness. Big T took the disappearances particularly hard. He'd been a cop for 20 years and prided himself on keeping people safe. Now he patrolled the campgrounds obsessively, checking and rechecking the locks on every door, testing the emergency lights, reinforcing cabin windows. I caught him one morning installing extra deadbolts on the craft cabin doors. "Something ain't right about these woods," he told me, his usually jovial face grim. 20 years walking a beat in Chicago's worst neighborhoods, never felt anything like this. It's like the forest itself is watching us. Rachel started holding daily counseling sessions for both campers and staff. The strain was showing on everyone. Jenny stopped swimming alone in the lake. Marcus abandoned his novel and spent his free time researching similar cases in the area. Sarah's craft projects took on a defensive theme: dream catchers and protective amulets that the kids wore like armor. Stephen aged years in those weeks. The easy smile that had been his trademark disappeared, replaced by dark circles under his eyes and a constant furrow in his brow. He barely slept, spending his nights reviewing security footage and his days coordinating with law enforcement. I overheard him one night on the phone with the camp's owner arguing against closing early. "We can't just abandon these kids," he was saying. "Their parents trust us. We have to figure this out." But figuring it out seemed impossible. The police had no leads. The FBI profilers offered vague theories about opportunistic predators. The local papers ran sensational stories about the Camp Pine Ridge kidnapper. Through it all, Kevin and Amanda remained gone, their empty bunks standing as silent reminders of our failure to protect them. The breaking point came on a Wednesday night in late July. The air was unusually thick, even for a Wisconsin summer, pressing down on us like a wet blanket. We'd moved all the remaining campers into the 2 cabins closest to the main lodge, with staff members sleeping in bunks at either end. The kids were finally asleep, their anxious whispers replaced by the soft sounds of steady breathing. I was on patrol with Big T that night, walking the perimeter of the camp for the 3rd time since sunset. We'd developed a routine: check every building, test every lock, shine our flashlights into the shadows between the trees. The police had their own patrols going, but we felt responsible for doing our part. Maybe if we'd been this vigilant earlier, Kevin and Amanda would still be here. Around midnight, we split up, Big T heading toward the lake while I checked the now empty cabins on the north side of camp. The moon was full, casting everything in a pale silvery light that made shadows seem deeper and darker than usual. The crickets were unusually quiet that night, something I didn't notice until later. I was near the old craft cabin when my radio crackled to life. Big T's voice came through, tight with an urgency I'd never heard from him before. "Mike." His whisper was barely audible. "Get to the boat dock, now. Don't use your flashlight." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I clicked my radio once to acknowledge and started moving, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The familiar paths felt different in the darkness, every root and rock a potential betrayal under my feet. I found Big T crouched behind the equipment shed near the dock, his bulk somehow compressed into the shadows. Without speaking, he pointed toward the tree line on the far side of the lake. At first I saw nothing but darkness. Then, there, a light moving slowly through the trees. Not the harsh beam of a flashlight or the steady glow of the police searchlights. This was warmer, more organic, like an old oil lantern. "Been watching it for 10 minutes, Big T whispered. "It's not following any patrol pattern, I know. And look, it's staying just inside the tree line, like whatever's carrying it doesn't want to be seen from the water." We should have called it in immediately. That was protocol. Report any suspicious activity to the police. Let them handle it. But something held us back. Maybe it was pride or responsibility, or just the desperate need to do something about the nightmare our summer had become. "We should check it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Big T nodded grimly. "Stay low, stay quiet. And kid?" He pulled something from his jacket, a hunting knife in a leather sheath. "Take this, just in case." We moved along the shoreline, using the shadows of trees and boathouses for cover. The light weaved its way through the forest, sometimes disappearing behind thick stands of pine, only to reappear several yards away. It seemed to be following some path only its bearer could see. After about 15 minutes, the light stopped moving in a small clearing about 30 yards into the woods. This was the part of the forest we'd warned campers away from, even before the disappearances. The ground was unstable from old logging operations, with hidden sinkholes and abandoned equipment scattered throughout. Big T gestured for me to circle left while he went right, creating a loose pincer movement around the clearing. As I moved through the underbrush, a sickly sweet smell hit me, like rotting meat mixed with something chemical. The air felt wrong here, heavier somehow, and the moonlight seemed to dim as if the trees themselves were absorbing it. Then I saw him. He stood in the center of the clearing, impossibly tall and thin, like a tree that had decided to wear human skin. His clothes were filthy rags, hanging from his skeletal frame in tatters. Matted hair and beard crawled down his chest, tangled with leaves and twigs, as if he'd been living wild in these woods for years. In one hand, he held an old railroad lantern, its light casting twisted shadows across the clearing. In the other, my heart stopped. In his other hand was a small backpack, covered in Pokémon characters. I recognized it immediately. It was Amanda's. The man hadn't noticed us yet. He was focused on something at his feet, what looked like a trap door set into the forest floor, almost invisible under years of accumulated leaves and debris. As I watched, he set down the lantern and began to pull at the door's handle, the rusted hinges protesting with a sound that made my teeth ache. I must have made some small noise, shifted my weight, stepped on a twig, breathed too loudly, because suddenly his head snapped up, turning toward my position with an unnatural quickness. His eyes caught the lantern light and reflected it back like an animal's, gleaming yellow in the darkness. The sight froze me in place, prey instinct taking over. "I can smell you," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that somehow carried clearly through the still air. "Fresh meat. Not like the others. Not yet." He straightened up to his full height. He must have been close to 7 feet tall, and smiled. His teeth were filed to points. That's when Big T made his move. With a roar that shattered the forest's silence, the former Chicago cop burst from his hiding place and charged. Despite his bad leg, despite his age, Big T moved like a freight train, catching the tall man around the waist and driving him away from the trapdoor. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the lantern toppling and rolling across the clearing. I should have helped immediately. That's what haunts me most about that night, that moment of hesitation. Instead, I found myself moving toward the trapdoor, drawn by a horrible certainty about what I might find below. The scream stopped me. Big T's voice filled with pain and shock. I spun around to see the tall man standing over him, something glinting in his hand. Blood looked black in the lantern light. "Your friend bleeds well," the man said, still smiling that pointed smile. "The children bled less, too small, too quick, but they screamed so sweetly." Something snapped inside me. The knife Big T had given me was suddenly in my hand, though I don't remember drawing it. I rushed forward, all thought of safety or strategy forgotten. The man turned to meet me, his own blade slashing through the space where my head had been a second before. What followed was a blur of violence and desperate movement. He was incredibly strong, but moved with a strange, jerky rhythm that made his attacks hard to predict. I managed to slash his arm and he howled, not in pain, but in what sounded like delight. He came at me harder, driving me back toward the trees. I tripped over an exposed root and went down hard. The man loomed over me, raising his knife for a killing blow. Then his eyes widened in surprise as Big T's flashlight connected with the back of his head with a sickening crack. The tall man staggered but didn't fall. He spun toward Big T, who stood swaying, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. Before either of them could move, multiple beams of light cut through the darkness, and voices shouted, "Police, drop your weapons!" The man's head snapped up like a startled deer's. For a moment he stood perfectly still, blood dripping from his arm, teeth bared in that terrible smile. Then he moved with that unnatural speed again, snatching up his lantern and darting between the trees. Gunshots cracked through the night, but by then he was gone, leaving only disturbed leaves and the lingering echo of his laughter. Everything after that became a chaos of activity. Paramedics treating Big T's wound, deep but not fatal, police securing the scene, forensics teams examining the trapdoor. Below it, they found a crude bunker, an old logging storage chamber that had been converted into something out of a nightmare. The walls were covered with drawings and writings, hundreds of newspaper clippings about missing children dating back to the 1960s, and Polaroid photos that made hardened detectives turn away. They found Kevin's sketchbook there, and Amanda's shoes, carefully arranged like trophies. But of the children themselves, there was no sign. The tunnel system branched off in several directions. Some passages collapsed, others seeming to stretch for miles under the forest. The search would continue for weeks, involving cave rescue teams and ground-penetrating radar, but the full extent of the underground network was never mapped. The events that followed changed everyone involved forever. Camp Pine Ridge closed permanently the next day. The remaining campers evacuated under police escort before dawn. Big T recovered from his wounds in the hospital, but the encounter left more than physical scars. He moved back to Chicago but never returned to security work, opening a small hardware store instead. Last I heard, he still keeps that bloodied flashlight mounted behind his counter as a reminder. Rachel Park abandoned her residency plans and switched to psychiatry, specializing in trauma counseling for children. Stephen Mitchell resigned as camp director and disappeared into the corporate world, though I heard he still sends anonymous donations to missing children's organizations every July. The man was never caught. The police investigation revealed a disturbing history, similar disappearances stretching back decades, always near summer camps or youth retreats across 3 states. They found evidence suggesting he'd once been a camp counselor himself in the 1960s, before something made him snap. His real name was never confirmed, but older locals called him the Lantern Man, speaking of him in whispers like some dark fairy tale. Kevin Zhang and Amanda Taylor were never found. The case remains open, one of dozens linked to the Lantern Man over the years. The families still hold out hope, but those of us who were there that night, who saw what was in that bunker, we carry a darker knowledge. Camp Pine Ridge was demolished in 1990. The land was reclaimed by the forest, though no developer has managed to build there. Every attempt abandoned after mysterious accidents and equipment failures. Local teens sometimes dare each other to camp there, telling stories about a tall figure seen moving through the trees at night, carrying an old railroad lantern. I'm 57 now, with grown children of my own who've never been to summer camp. When they ask why, I make up excuses about expense or logistics. How could I explain that their father still wakes up sweating on summer nights, hearing phantom laughter in the darkness? That I can't see a camping lantern without remembering filed teeth gleaming in its light? Sometimes I dream about that night. But in my dreams, I'm faster, braver. I reach the kids in time. I stop the monster. I change the ending. Then I wake up and remember that real horror stories rarely have clean endings. Some mysteries remain unsolved, some wounds never fully heal, and some summers never really end. The forest still stands, darker and deeper than ever. And on very quiet nights, if you drive past the old camp road, locals say you might see a light moving through the trees. Like a lantern, they say. Like someone searching. Still searching. It was a balmy June evening when everything changed. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the promise of summer adventures. Little did I know that this night would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. My name is Alex, and I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world around us. It all started about 6 months ago, on what should have been just another lazy weekend hanging out with my friends. There were 4 of us, myself, Ethan, Marcus, and Zach. We'd been inseparable since high school, and now, in our early 20s, we still clung to the routines of our youth. Our usual haunt was Ethan's place, a cozy 2-story house with a finished basement that had become our personal haven. That fateful night, we were sprawled across Ethan's worn leather couch, engrossed in our weekly video game tournament. The basement was a cacophony of button mashing, trash talk, and the occasional victory whoop. As the clock ticked past 7:30 p.m., none of us had any inkling of the horrors that awaited us. It was during a particularly intense round of our favorite fighting game that things took their first turn. Marcus, always the most competitive among us, let out a string of curses as his character was obliterated on screen. In a fit of rage, he hurled his controller across the room. We all watched in stunned silence as it smashed against the wall, pieces of plastic scattering across the floor. "Dude, what the hell?" Ethan exclaimed, jumping up from his seat. His face was a mix of anger and disbelief as he surveyed the remains of his prized controller. Marcus's anger quickly melted into sheepish regret. "Shit, man, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Look, let me make it up to you. We'll go to Megamart right now and I'll buy you a new one. Top of the line, I promise." The tension in the room dissipated slightly at Marcus's offer. Ethan ran a hand through his disheveled brown hair, considering the proposal. "Fine," he sighed after a moment. "But you're buying dinner too." That was how we found ourselves piling into Ethan's beat-up Nissan Altima at 8 p.m. on a Saturday night, headed for the local Megamart. The drive was filled with our usual banter, debates over which fast food joint had the best fries, and half-hearted complaints about our jobs. Normal stuff, everyday stuff. The kind of conversation you have when you're young and invincible, and the worst thing you can imagine is a boring Monday at work. God, how I miss those simple worries now. Megamart was its usual self, a sprawling box store on the outskirts of town, its parking lot a sea of faded white lines and flickering sodium lamps. We made our way inside, the cool air conditioning a welcome relief from the muggy summer night. As Marcus made good on his promise to replace Ethan's controller, Zach and I wandered the aisles aimlessly, killing time and cracking jokes about the weird products we found. It was in the clearance section, wedged between off-brand cereals and dented cans of soup, that Zach's eyes lit up with a mischievous gleam. "Hey, check this out," he said, holding up a small, unmarked bottle filled with what looked like gummy bears. "You guys ever hear about these?" I shook my head, but something about the way Zach was grinning made me uneasy. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They're not just regular candy, if you know what I mean. My cousin told me about them. Supposedly, they'll make you see things, experience things, like nothing else. I felt my stomach tighten. You mean they're drugs? Zach, come on, man. We don't need to mess with that stuff. But Zach was already shaking his head, that grin still plastered across his face. It's not like that, Alex. It's all natural, totally safe. Just a little fun, you know, to spice things up a bit. I wanted to argue further, but Ethan and Marcus had finished their shopping and were heading our way. Before I could say anything else, Zach had pocketed the bottle and was acting as if nothing had happened. As we left Megamart, our stomachs full of greasy burgers and fries from the nearby drive-thru, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The night air seemed cooler than before, and shadows seemed to linger just a bit longer at the edges of the parking lot. We piled back into Ethan's car, and that's when Zach dropped his bombshell. He pulled out the bottle of gummies, waving it like a trophy. "Who's up for a little adventure tonight?" Ethan and Marcus exchanged excited glances, but I felt my heart sink. "Guys, I don't think this is a good idea. We don't even know what's really in those things." "Don't be such a buzzkill, Alex," Marcus chimed in. "It's just a bit of fun. What's the worst that could happen?" Those words would come back to haunt me in the days to come. As the others eagerly discussed where we could go to try out Zach's illicit purchase, I remembered something that made my blood run cold. "My family has a cabin," I heard myself say as if from a distance. "It's about an hour's drive from here out by Echo Lake. We could go there." I don't know why I suggested it. Maybe some part of me thought that if we were going to do this, at least we should be somewhere safe, somewhere familiar. Or maybe, just maybe, some darker part of me wanted to see what would happen. The guys loved the idea, of course. Within minutes we were on the road, leaving the familiar lights of our town behind and heading into the darkness of the countryside. As we drove, I filled them in on the details of the cabin. It wasn't some run-down shack in the woods like you might see in a horror movie. My parents had bought it as a vacation home a few years back, and it was more like a small, modern house. It's got 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a decent-sized kitchen, and a living room, I explained as we wound our way through increasingly rural roads. There's woods on one side, and behind the cabin, there's a big hill that leads down to an old cornfield. What I didn't mention was the strange feeling I always got when we visited the cabin. It was nothing I could put my finger on, just a vague sense of unease that would creep over me as night fell. I'd always brushed it off as my imagination running wild in the quiet of the countryside. Now, as we drew closer to our destination, that feeling began to gnaw at the edges of my mind once more. We arrived at the cabin just after 11 p.m. As I pulled the spare key from its hiding place under a loose board on the porch, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. I glanced around, my eyes straining in the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie silvery light over the landscape. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of movement near the old storage shed where we kept the ATVs, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. Inside, the cabin was just as I remembered it, clean, cozy, and utterly ordinary. The guys wasted no time making themselves at home, with Ethan claiming the main bedroom and Marcus sprawling out on the living room couch. Zach, meanwhile, was already opening the bottle of gummies, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Last chance to join in, Alex," he said, holding out the bottle to me. "You sure you don't want to take the ride with us?" I shook my head firmly. "Someone's got to stay sober to keep an eye on you idiots," I said, trying to keep my tone light despite the growing sense of dread in my stomach. Zach shrugged. "Suit yourself, man. More for us." I watched as my 3 best friends each took one of the innocuous-looking gummies. For a few minutes, nothing seemed to happen. Then, gradually, I began to notice changes. It started with Ethan, who suddenly burst into uncontrollable laughter at some joke that existed only in his mind. Marcus wasn't far behind, his eyes widening as he stared at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Zach, surprisingly, seemed the least affected. He sat on the edge of the couch, watching the others with an odd, detached expression. When he caught me looking at him, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. As the night wore on, things got stranger. Ethan disappeared into the bedroom, the sound of muffled singing occasionally drifting through the door. Marcus, meanwhile, had turned on the old radio we kept at the cabin and was now engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate interpretive dance to Sweet Caroline. I tried to keep things under control, making sure no one wandered outside or did anything too crazy. But as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., exhaustion began to set in. Ethan was passed out in the bedroom, Marcus had finally collapsed on the couch, and Zach announced he was going to sit in the car for a while to clear his head. Feeling like I could finally relax a bit, I headed to the smaller bedroom with the bunk beds. I was just about to drift off to sleep when I heard it, a soft, persistent tapping at the window. At first I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just a branch in the wind. But there was no wind that night, and as I lay there in the darkness, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Gathering my courage, I sat up and looked toward the window. In the pale moonlight, I could see nothing out of the ordinary, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Just as I was about to get up and investigate, my phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly fell out of the bed. It was my dad. "Hey, sport," his cheerful voice came through the speaker, jarringly normal in the face of my growing terror. "Saw on the trail cams that you guys are at the cabin. I might come down in the morning for some hunting. Could you get my compound bow ready?" I agreed, my voice shaking slightly as I tried to sound normal. After hanging up, I forced myself to get out of bed and prepare my dad's hunting gear, which for some reason was stored on the opposite bunk. As I sorted through the arrows, my hands trembling, I remembered Zach was still out in the car. Not wanting to leave him out there all night, I called his cell. "Hey, man," I said when he picked up, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "It's getting late. Why don't you come back inside?" Zach agreed, and I hung up, relief washing over me. But that relief was short-lived. A few minutes later, I heard the doorknob jiggle. Assuming it was Zach, I walked over to let him in. But as I reached for the handle, I glanced out the small window in the door and felt my blood turn to ice. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the harsh porch light, was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was impossibly tall, its shoulders level with the top of the doorframe. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over a skeletal frame that looked on the verge of collapse. But it was the face that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Black, empty sockets stared at me where eyes should have been. Its mouth was a jagged maw of overlapping needle-sharp teeth, and when it spoke, it was with Zach's voice. "Let me in, Alex," it said, its lipless mouth somehow forming the words perfectly. "It's cold out here, man." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a bad trip, anything other than what it appeared to be. The creature began to work the doorknob more forcefully, its inhuman strength evident in the way the entire door shook in its frame. I could hear the wood beginning to splinter. In a panic, I remembered my father's shotgun in the other bedroom. I sprinted across the cabin, nearly tripping over Marcus's prone form on the couch. The noise must have roused him because I heard him stir and then let out a blood-curdling scream. "What the fuck is that?" Marcus yelled, now fully awake and pointing at the door in terror. I didn't answer, too focused on retrieving the shotgun and the shells I knew were kept on the living room table. With shaking hands, I loaded the weapon, the sound of the creature's assault on the door growing more frenzied by the second. Just as the door began to give way, I raised the shotgun and fired. Once, twice, 3 times, the blasts deafening in the confined space of the cabin. The creature stumbled backward, letting out a scream that sounded like a combination of a woman's shriek and the howl of a wounded animal. To my horror, it didn't fall. Instead, it turned and ran with impossible speed, covering the distance to the cornfield in mere seconds. The sound of cornstalks rustling and snapping in its wake was the only indication that what we'd seen had been real. In a daze, we gathered Ethan from the bedroom and ran to the car. To our shock and relief, we found Zach passed out in the driver's seat, apparently having never made it back to the cabin. We piled in and sped away, leaving behind the nightmarish scene at Echo Lake. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We researched local legends, indigenous folklore, anything that might explain the creature we'd encountered. The closest match we found was something called a Wendigo, a mythical creature of Algonquin legend, known for its insatiable hunger and ability to mimic human voices. But even that explanation feels insufficient in the face of what we experienced. To this day, I haven't returned to the cabin, and I doubt I ever will. The others don't like to talk about that night, preferring to blame it on bad drugs or shared hallucinations. But I know what I saw. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I sometimes think I hear a voice, Zach's voice, calling to me from the darkness. "Let me in, Alex. It's cold out here." And I lie awake, wondering if the nightmare at Echo Lake ever really ended, or if it's just waiting for me to let my guard down once more. The days following our terrifying encounter at Echo Lake passed in a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. We tried to go about our normal lives, but the memory of that creature, its impossibly tall, emaciated form and those rows of jagged teeth, haunted our every waking moment. At first, we clung to each other, finding solace in our shared experience. We'd meet up at Ethan's place, huddled in his basement, speaking in hushed tones about what we'd seen. But as the weeks wore on, cracks began to form in our once unshakable friendship. Marcus was the first to distance himself. He threw himself into his work, taking on extra shifts and avoiding our calls. When we did manage to corner him, he'd laugh off that night as nothing more than a bad trip, refusing to acknowledge the terror we'd all felt. Ethan went the opposite direction. He became obsessed with finding an explanation, spending countless hours online researching cryptids and local legends. His room became a cluttered mess of printed articles, hand-drawn maps, and blurry photographs of supposed Wendigo sightings. We watched helplessly as the easygoing friend we once knew transformed into a paranoid conspiracy theorist. Zach, surprisingly, seemed the least affected, at least on the surface. He continued to joke and laugh, insisting that we all needed to lighten up. But I noticed the way his eyes would dart nervously around a room, how he'd flinch at unexpected noises. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, I'd catch a glimpse of raw fear in his eyes that chilled me to the bone. As for me, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I told myself it was just a shared hallucination, a result of stress, sleep deprivation, and possibly contaminated food. But deep down, I knew the truth. The weight of the shotgun in my hands, the splintering of wood as the creature tried to break down the door. These were too vivid, too real to be mere figments of our imagination. It was about 3 months after that fateful night when things took another dark turn. I was at home trying to distract myself with mindless TV when my phone buzzed with a text from Zach. "Need to talk. Meet me at Oakwood Park, now." Something about the urgency of the message sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my keys and headed out. Oakwood Park was eerily quiet when I arrived. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the deserted playground. I found Zach sitting on a bench near the old oak tree that gave the park its name. As I approached, I noticed how pale and drawn he looked, dark circles under his eyes speaking of sleepless nights. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who else to turn to. I sat down beside him, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. "What's going on, Zach?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring off into the gathering darkness. When he finally spoke, his words made my blood run cold. "It followed us home, Alex. The thing from the cabin. It's here." I wanted to dismiss his words as paranoia, to tell him he was imagining things, but the raw fear in his voice was all too familiar. "What do you mean?" I asked, dreading the answer. Zach ran a shaking hand through his hair. "I've been seeing it. At first it was just glimpses, a shadow in my peripheral vision, gone when I turned to look. But it's getting bolder. Last night I woke up and it was standing at the foot of my bed, just watching me." A gust of wind rustled through the leaves above us, and we both jumped. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked, "Have you told the others?" He shook his head. "Marcus won't even talk about that night anymore. And Ethan, man, Ethan's so far down the rabbit hole, I don't think he'd be any help. You're the only one I can trust, Alex." I felt the weight of his words settle on my shoulders. Part of me wanted to run, to go home and pretend this conversation had never happened. But I couldn't abandon my friend. "What do you want to do?" Zach took a deep breath. "We need to go back to the cabin. Whatever that thing is, it started there. Maybe we can find some answers, figure out how to stop it." Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to put as much distance between myself and Echo Lake as possible. But looking at Zach's desperate face, I knew I had no choice. "Okay," I heard myself say. "We'll go back." The drive to Echo Lake the next day was tense, filled with an oppressive silence that neither of us dared to break. As we wound our way through the familiar country roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were driving towards our doom. The cabin looked just as we'd left it, peaceful and unassuming in the late afternoon sun. But as we stepped out of the car, that old sense of unease washed over me. The air felt thicker somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We searched the cabin first, looking for any sign of the creature's presence. Everything was as we'd left it that night, including the splintered front door, which had never been repaired. Finding nothing inside, we ventured out to explore the surrounding area. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown cornfield, Zach suggested we check the old storage shed. I hesitated, remembering the flicker of movement I'd seen there on that fateful night. But Zach was already moving towards it, leaving me no choice but to follow. The shed door creaked ominously as Zach pulled it open. The interior was dark, filled with the musty smell of disuse. As our eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed something odd, scratch marks, deep and jagged, covering the walls. "Alex," Zach's voice was tight with fear. "Look at this." He was pointing to the far corner of the shed. There, half hidden behind an old tarp, was a hole in the floor. It was roughly circular, about 3 feet in diameter, and seemed to descend into utter blackness. Before I could stop him, Zach was moving towards it. "We need to see where it leads," he said, his voice filled with a manic energy that scared me more than the hole itself. "Zach, no!" I reached out to grab him, but I was too late. As Zach peered into the darkness, a long gray arm shot out of the hole, wrapping around his ankle. I heard him scream as he was yanked downward, his fingers scrabbling uselessly at the dirt floor. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I saw Zach's terrified face as he was pulled into the darkness. I heard the sickening crunch of bones breaking as he was forced through an opening too small for a human body. And then, in the span of a heartbeat, he was gone. I stood there, frozen in horror, staring at the hole that had swallowed my friend. From its depths, I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. Zach's voice, but wrong somehow, distorted and inhuman. "Alex," it called, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small shed. "Come join us, Alex. It's not so bad down here." I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not stopping until I reached my car. I sped away from Echo Lake, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I never saw Zach again. The police searched the area, of course, but they found no trace of him or the mysterious hole in the shed. They dismissed my story as the ramblings of a traumatized friend, suggesting that Zach had simply run away to start a new life. Ethan and Marcus were no help. When I told them what had happened, Ethan became even more withdrawn, muttering about government cover-ups and supernatural conspiracies. Marcus simply refused to believe me, accusing me of playing some sick joke. In the years since that day, I've tried to move on with my life. I left our hometown, started a new job in a big city far away from Echo Lake. But the memories of what happened there still haunt me. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear scratching at my window. In my darker moments, I wonder if the creature followed me here, if it's just biding its time before it comes for me too. And always, I hear Zach's voice in my dreams, calling to me from the darkness. Join us, Alex. It's not so bad down here. I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering how long I can outrun the horrors of Echo Lake. And in the quiet of the night, I find myself asking a terrifying question. What if, one day, I decide to answer that call? Combat changes you. 2 tours in Afghanistan taught me that much. The way you move, the way you process threat assessment, the way you build relationships, it all shifts into something civilians can't quite understand. That's why my friendship with Mike made so much sense. As a VA therapist, he bridged both worlds, understanding the weight we carry while helping others set it down. We met through Tessa, his therapy dog. She wasn't just any service animal. She was a retired military working dog from the 101st Airborne. The stories about her 2 confirmed takedowns in combat might have been embellished, but her training was unmistakable. I'd worked with enough military dogs to recognize the way she moved, the way she processed her environment. Her bond with Mike went beyond the usual handler-canine relationship. They seemed to read each other's thoughts. Then there was Butch, 5'2" of pure Italian bravado, packed into a self-proclaimed ex-powerlifter who still lived in his mother's basement. He'd never served, never seen combat, but he had a way of lightening the darkest moods with his absurd stories and wild claims. We gave him endless grief about his living situation. But truth was, having someone completely removed from our military experience helped ground us. The 3 of us, plus Tessa, had been planning wilderness excursions for months. Mike and I approached it with military precision. Detailed maps, equipment lists, contingency plans. Butch treated it like he was preparing for a reality show, buying expensive gear he barely knew how to use and watching countless YouTube survival videos. Initially, we'd planned to head deep into Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The isolation appealed to our survivalist ambitions, true wilderness where we could test our skills against nature. But Butch's mother needed him back for bingo night, a detail we'd never let him live down. So we settled for the forests west of Cadillac. Close enough for a weekend trip, far enough to feel wild. The compromised location should have been our first warning. Sometimes the universe sends you signs, and ignoring them has consequences. We hit the trailhead later than planned. The November sun was already low, painting the forest in long shadows that seemed to reach for us like grasping fingers. My combat instincts noted multiple tactical disadvantages: limited visibility, unfamiliar terrain, declining light conditions. But we pressed on. The first sign came from Tessa. Military working dogs develop specific behaviors, patterns you learn to read if you work with them long enough. Her usual confident point position had shifted. She kept pressing against Mike's leg, forcing him to adjust his stride. Classic anxiety behavior. "She's been clingy all day," Mike said when I mentioned it. Probably just the new environment. But I'd seen Tessa work. She'd been in active combat zones, handled high-stress situations with professional calm. This was different. Her head kept swiveling toward specific sections of forest, tracking something none of us could see. We found a clearing about 2 miles in, just as the last useful light was fading. The site looked ideal. Good sight lines, defensible position, close to water. Basic military considerations that still influenced our thinking years after discharge. Butch, true to form, had packed enough gear for a small platoon. While Mike and Tessa went to gather firewood, I helped Butch set up our base camp. 2 four-season tents positioned for optimal security coverage. A fire pit arranged to provide both heat and visibility without compromising our night vision. Small details that come naturally when you've spent time in combat zones. "Dig me a foxhole and I'll sleep in it," Butch joked as we worked. The laughter felt good, normal. None of us had any idea how much we'd soon wish for the protection of a proper fighting position. When Mike returned with the firewood, something had changed in his demeanor. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by the kind of controlled tension I recognized from patrol missions. Tessa's behavior had escalated, not just nudging him now, but actively interfering with his movements, growling at seemingly empty sections of forest. "Nothing out there," Mike reported, but his tone suggested otherwise. His eyes kept scanning the tree line, a habit you develop when you've been shot at enough times. But something's got her spooked. I watched Tessa closely as we set up camp. Military working dogs undergo extensive training to overcome natural fear responses. They learn to handle gunfire, explosions, and chaos without losing focus. Whatever was triggering her hadn't been covered in that training. Butch noticed too, though he tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe she smells my mom's bingo dabbers," he joked, but his voice had lost its usual bravado. The forest seemed to swallow his words, the usual echo strangely absent. As darkness settled, our military training began asserting itself more strongly. Mike and I found ourselves naturally establishing overlapping fields of fire, positioning our rifles for quick access. Even Butch's pepper spray suddenly seemed inadequate, a civilian solution to what was feeling increasingly like a tactical situation. Tessa's behavior became more pronounced. She positioned herself between Mike and the eastern tree line, her attention fixed on a specific point in the darkness. She hadn't touched her food, a red flag for any military dog handler. These animals are trained to eat when given the opportunity, knowing the next meal might be hours away. The forest had gone quiet in a way that triggered combat memories. No bird calls, no small animal movements, no insect sounds. In Afghanistan, this kind of silence usually preceded an ambush. The tree that crashed onto our fire showed planning and strength that defied natural explanation. It didn't fall. It was placed with precision that suggested intelligence. The impact scattered our carefully constructed fire, plunging us into near total darkness. Military training kicked in instantly. Mike and I moved to defensive positions, rifles ready. Butch, to his credit, maintained his composure, though his hand shook as he gripped his pepper spray. Tessa's growl had changed to something I'd never heard from a military dog, a sound of pure, primal fear. The yelps came next. Deep, resonant calls that shouldn't have come from any natural creature. They showed tactical coordination, coming from multiple directions, using the darkness and terrain to mask their origins. Classic encirclement strategy. When the first tent disappeared, it moved with impossible speed. There one moment, gone the next, dragged into darkness by something we could barely process. The second tent followed seconds later, the sound of ripping fabric mixing with those inhuman calls. Through the dying firelight, we caught glimpses of movement, massive shapes moving with a fluid grace that contradicted their size. My combat experience struggled to categorize what I was seeing. Not human, not animal, but something that seemed to understand tactical warfare. The 3 figures that emerged from the trees moved with coordinated precision. Their height, easily 8 feet, wasn't their most unsettling feature. It was the intelligence in their movement, the way they maintained perfect tactical spacing, using the shadows for cover while herding us toward a predetermined point. Their eyes delivered the final shock, blue, red, and orange, glowing with an inner light that defied biology. The creatures were massive, muscled in ways that made Butch's powerlifting stories seem quaint. Their fur, a reddish-brown color, seemed to absorb what little light remained. The roar they unleashed wasn't just sound, it was a tactical weapon designed to disorient and terrify. I've heard artillery bombardments that were less effective at triggering primal fear. Our withdrawal wasn't planned. It was pure survival instinct overriding training. We ran as a unit, military bearing abandoned in favor of speed. The path back seemed longer, darker, filled with sounds of pursuit that seemed to come from impossible angles above and around us. Mike's truck appeared like salvation, but the true horror waited in its headlights. Seeing them clearly for the first time shattered any remaining doubt about their nature. These weren't animals, weren't people in costumes. Their morphology was wrong. Joints that bent in impossible ways. Muscles arranged in patterns that defied evolutionary logic. The way one shielded its eyes revealed another tactical advantage. They operated better in darkness, using our natural limitations against us. The headlights provided our only advantage, and Mike exploited it perfectly, reversing us out of their territory with the skill of a combat driver. The drive back passed in shocked silence. Each of us was processing what we'd seen through different filters. My combat experience, Mike's therapeutic training, Butch's civilian perspective. Tessa lay in the back seat, still trembling, her military training overwhelmed by something beyond her experience. Our gear was gone, thousands of dollars of equipment left behind in that dark forest. None of us suggested going back for it. Some losses are acceptable when survival is at stake. In the days that followed, we tried to rationalize what we'd encountered. My military background provided frameworks for threat assessment, but nothing that could explain what we'd seen. Mike's professional training offered psychological perspectives, but no explanations for physical impossibilities. We researched local histories, finding fragments of similar stories buried in old newspapers and tribal legends. Tales of things that hunted in the forests around Cadillac, of coordinated pack behavior from creatures that shouldn't exist. Our YouTube survival channel never materialized. Some experiences don't need to be shared. Some warnings don't need to be broadcast. Butch moved out of his mother's basement, deciding suburb life wasn't so bad after all. Mike continued his therapy work, but Tessa retired fully. Her working days ended by something beyond her training. I still serve as a consultant for military operations, but I've added new elements to my training recommendations. Sometimes the greatest threats aren't the ones you're trained to face. Sometimes survival depends not on your equipment or skills, but on recognizing when you're dealing with something beyond human understanding. The forest holds secrets older than human civilization, predators that understand warfare in ways we never imagined. They let us play our survival games, test ourselves against nature's mundane challenges. But sometimes we stray into territories where different rules apply, where our military training and modern technology mean nothing. I still venture into the wilderness, but with new respect and awareness. Every snapped twig, every sudden silence, every unexpected shadow carries new meaning. Because now I know, some things in this world have been conducting warfare since before humans invented it, and they're better at it than we'll ever be. The forests west of Cadillac hold their secrets. Sometimes, on dark nights, I think about those glowing eyes and coordinated movements. I think about how they tested our defenses, evaluated our capabilities, and let us escape. And I wonder, was it mercy or just a warning? Because the true horror isn't that such creatures exist. It's that they're intelligent enough to choose their battles, wise enough to know when to reveal themselves, and powerful enough to let their prey escape with a story few will believe. Combat changes you. 2 tours in Afghanistan taught me that much. The way you move, the way you process threat assessment, the way you build relationships, it all shifts into something civilians can't quite understand. That's why my friendship with Mike made so much sense. As a VA therapist, he bridged both worlds, understanding the weight we carry while helping others set it down. We met through Tessa, his therapy dog. She wasn't just any service animal. She was a retired military working dog from the 101st Airborne. The stories about her 2 confirmed takedowns in combat might have been embellished, but her training was unmistakable. I'd worked with enough military dogs to recognize the way she moved, the way she processed her environment. Her bond with Mike went beyond the usual handler-canine relationship. They seemed to read each other's thoughts. Then there was Butch, 5'2" of pure Italian bravado, packed into a self-proclaimed ex-powerlifter who still lived in his mother's basement. He'd never served, never seen combat, but he had a way of lightening the darkest moods with his absurd stories and wild claims. We gave him endless grief about his living situation. But truth was, having someone completely removed from our military experience helped ground us. The 3 of us, plus Tessa, had been planning wilderness excursions for months. Mike and I approached it with military precision, detailed maps, equipment lists, contingency plans. Butch treated it like he was preparing for a reality show, buying expensive gear he barely knew how to use and watching countless YouTube survival videos. Initially, we'd planned to head deep into Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The isolation appealed to our survivalist ambitions, true wilderness where we could test our skills against nature. But Butch's mother needed him back for bingo night, a detail we'd never let him live down. So we settled for the forests west of Cadillac. Close enough for a weekend trip, far enough to feel wild. The compromised location should have been our first warning. Sometimes the universe sends you signs, and ignoring them has consequences. We hit the trailhead later than planned. The November sun was already low, painting the forest in long shadows that seemed to reach for us like grasping fingers. My combat instincts noted multiple tactical disadvantages: limited visibility, unfamiliar terrain, declining light conditions. But we pressed on. The first sign came from Tessa. Military working dogs develop specific behaviors, patterns you learn to read if you work with them long enough. Her usual confident point position had shifted. She kept pressing against Mike's leg, forcing him to adjust his stride. Classic anxiety behavior. "She's been clingy all day," Mike said when I mentioned it. Probably just the new environment. But I'd seen Tessa work. She'd been in active combat zones, handled high-stress situations with professional calm. This was different. Her head kept swiveling toward specific sections of forest, tracking something none of us could see. We found a clearing about 2 miles in, just as the last useful light was fading. The site looked ideal. Good sight lines, defensible position, close to water. Basic military considerations that still influenced our thinking years after discharge. Butch, true to form, had packed enough gear for a small platoon. While Mike and Tessa went to gather firewood, I helped Butch set up our base camp. 2 four-season tents positioned for optimal security coverage. A fire pit arranged to provide both heat and visibility without compromising our night vision. Small details that come naturally when you've spent time in combat zones. "Dig me a foxhole and I'll sleep in it," Butch joked as we worked. The laughter felt good, normal. None of us had any idea how much we'd soon wish for the protection of a proper fighting position. When Mike returned with the firewood, something had changed in his demeanor. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by the kind of controlled tension I recognized from patrol missions. Tessa's behavior had escalated, not just nudging him now, but actively interfering with his movements, growling at seemingly empty sections of forest. "Nothing out there," Mike reported, but his tone suggested otherwise. His eyes kept scanning the tree line, a habit you develop when you've been shot at enough times. but something's got her spooked. I watched Tessa closely as we set up camp. Military working dogs undergo extensive training to overcome natural fear responses. They learn to handle gunfire, explosions, and chaos without losing focus. Whatever was triggering her hadn't been covered in that training. Butch noticed too, though he tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe she smells my mom's bingo dabbers," he joked, but his voice had lost its usual bravado. The forest seemed to swallow his words, the usual echo strangely absent. As darkness settled, our military training began asserting itself more strongly. Mike and I found ourselves naturally establishing overlapping fields of fire, positioning our rifles for quick access. Even Butch's pepper spray suddenly seemed inadequate, a civilian solution to what was feeling increasingly like a tactical situation. Tessa's behavior became more pronounced. She positioned herself between Mike and the eastern tree line, her attention fixed on a specific point in the darkness. She hadn't touched her food, a red flag for any military dog handler. These animals are trained to eat when given the opportunity, knowing the next meal might be hours away. The forest had gone quiet in a way that triggered combat memories. No bird calls, no small animal movements, no insect sounds. In Afghanistan, this kind of silence usually preceded an ambush. The tree that crashed onto our fire showed planning and strength that defied natural explanation. It didn't fall. It was placed with precision that suggested intelligence. The impact scattered our carefully constructed fire, plunging us into near total darkness. Military training kicked in instantly. Mike and I moved to defensive positions, rifles ready. Butch, to his credit, maintained his composure, though his hand shook as he gripped his pepper spray. Tessa's growl had changed to something I'd never heard from a military dog, a sound of pure, primal fear. The yelps came next. Deep, resonant calls that shouldn't have come from any natural creature. They showed tactical coordination, coming from multiple directions, using the darkness and terrain to mask their origins. Classic encirclement strategy. The investigation that followed was an exercise in frustration and bureaucratic obstruction. The coroner's initial report listed cause of death as exsanguination due to multiple traumatic injuries, but couldn't categorize the nature of those injuries. The forensics team found no usable fingerprints, no DNA evidence, nothing to suggest human involvement. The symbols on the cabin walls were photographed and sent to experts in archaeology, anthropology, and linguistics. None could identify their origin or meaning, though two of the consultants reportedly quit their positions shortly after examining the photos. More disappearances followed. Over the next 3 weeks, 4 hikers vanished in the same general area. Each time we found similar scenes: abandoned camps, drag marks leading nowhere, and those same symbols carved into nearby trees. The county commissioner ordered the trails closed, citing dangerous wildlife activity, but we knew better. Whatever was out there wasn't any kind of wildlife we'd ever encountered. Dave became obsessed with the case. He spent his off hours researching local history, interviewing old-timers, and compiling notes about similar incidents going back decades. He started losing weight, wasn't sleeping. I'd catch him staring into the woods behind his house, muttering about patterns and cycles. Then came that final phone call at 2:47 a.m. on a moonless night in late September. "It's here, John," he whispered, his voice trembling. "In my backyard. I can see it moving. It's beautiful. Terrible, but beautiful. The symbols, I understand them now. They're not warnings, they're an invitation." I broke every speed limit getting to his house, but I was too late. Dave's back door stood wide open, the screen torn from its hinges. His research was scattered across the kitchen table: printouts, old newspaper clippings, hand-drawn copies of the symbols. His coffee was still warm in its cup. In the wet grass of his backyard, I found his flashlight, still on, pointing toward the tree line. The beam illuminated a series of fresh symbols carved into the trunk of an old oak tree. They seemed to pulse with a faint, phosphorescent glow. The official investigation concluded that Dave had suffered a mental breakdown and walked into the forest. They found no body, no evidence of foul play. His disappearance was classified as a probable suicide, and the case was closed. But I knew the truth, and I couldn't let it go. I took a leave of absence and dedicated myself to following Dave's research, trying to understand what he had discovered in those final days. That's how I found the journal, hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of that nightmare cabin. It belonged to Thomas Blackwood, a former Forest Service biologist who had lived in the cabin during the 1950s. The journal documented his gradual discovery of something ancient in those woods, something that had been there long before European settlers arrived, before the indigenous peoples hunted in those forests, perhaps before humans walked the earth at all. Blackwood's final entry, dated April 15, 1957, was almost illegible, the handwriting frantic and erratic. It's not malevolent. That's what makes it so terrifying. It simply exists, operates according to rules we can't comprehend. The symbols are its language, its mathematics, its art, all at once. To understand them is to begin thinking in its patterns, and once that happens, you start to change. I can feel myself changing. The forest is no longer outside me. I am no longer entirely human. It's coming now. I can hear it singing. The rest of the page was blank except for a series of symbols that matched those we'd found in the cabin. I took the journal to Dr. Eleanor Chen, a professor of anthropology at the University of Oklahoma. She spent 3 days examining it before calling me, her academic skepticism shattered. These symbols, she said, they appear in virtually identical forms in ancient sites across the world: Cambodia, Peru, Nigeria, Ireland, always in deep forests, always associated with disappearances. What you found, this could rewrite our understanding of human history, or end it. Dr. Chen's revelation spurred me to action. I took an extended leave from work, converted my garage into a research center, and began mapping every disappearance in McCurtain County's history. The pattern was undeniable once I saw it laid out: clusters of vanishings every 40 years, always centered around that same section of forest. The previous cycle had peaked in 1955, right before Blackwood's disappearance. The cycle before that culminated in 1915, when an entire survey team of 7 men vanished while mapping the area. The symbols were the key. I spent weeks studying them, comparing Blackwood's drawings to the photos from the cabin and the marks on Dave's tree. They weren't static. They evolved, changed subtly over time. The more I studied them, the more I began to understand what Dave meant about them being an invitation. They seemed to pull at something deep in my mind, suggesting patterns and connections that existed just beyond normal human perception. Late one night, after 18 hours of continuous research, I had a breakthrough. The symbols weren't just writing or art. They were a form of mathematical equation, describing the transformation of three-dimensional space into something else. The creature wasn't hiding in our forest. It was letting us glimpse tiny fragments of its forest, a place that overlapped with ours but operated according to entirely different physical laws. I knew what I had to do. I gathered my equipment, cameras, sensors, recording devices, and 4 different weapons, including my service Glock and a custom-built tranquilizer rifle. I'd spent my life savings on specialized gear, infrared cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and a military-grade motion tracking system. Whatever this thing was, I was going to document it, prove it existed, and maybe find out what happened to Dave. The cabin was exactly as we'd left it, though the symbols on the walls had shifted, forming new patterns that seemed to writhe in my flashlight beam. I set up my equipment with methodical precision, just as I'd rehearsed dozens of times in my garage. Motion sensors at every approach, cameras covering all angles, EMF detectors scanning continuously. Then I settled in to wait. 3 days passed. I stayed awake through most of them, sustained by coffee and energy drinks, monitoring my equipment. Nothing triggered the sensors, But the symbols kept changing, gradually forming a pattern I recognized from Blackwood's journal, the same configuration that appeared on his final page. On the fourth night, everything electronic died simultaneously. Not a gradual power drain, but an instant cessation of all electrical activity. Even my watch stopped. The air grew thick, making each breath feel like inhaling molasses. That's when I heard it. The same rhythmic vibration from before, but now it carried meaning. The symbols had done their work, rewiring my brain just enough to perceive a fraction of what it was trying to communicate. It emerged from between the trees, though emerged isn't quite right. Space itself seemed to fold around it, revealing glimpses of something vast and geometrically impossible. What I'd seen before were just pieces of it, like a three-dimensional being trying to comprehend a shadow of a four-dimensional object. In that moment, I understood why people went mad trying to describe it. The entity existed in more directions than my mind could process, each movement revealing new aspects that shouldn't be possible. I raised my weapon, more from instinct than any real belief it would help. The creature's response was to shift reality around itself, creating a space where my bullets would never have existed. Then it spoke, not in words, but in concepts that bloomed directly in my consciousness. I understood then what had happened to Dave, to Blackwood, to all the others. They hadn't been taken. They had been offered a choice. The entity was a guardian, but not of our forest. It protected the boundaries between spaces, the membrane between realities. Those it took were individuals who could perceive these boundaries, people whose minds were flexible enough to comprehend existence beyond our limited dimension. The symbols were both a test and a preparation, gradually adjusting human consciousness to perceive a broader spectrum of reality. I saw Dave then, or what Dave had become. He moved through the spaces between spaces, his form suggesting geometries that hurt to look at. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't human anymore either. He had accepted the entity's invitation, chosen to evolve beyond the constraints of our reality. He tried to communicate with me, but his thoughts now operated on frequencies my mind couldn't fully process. What got through was a mixture of ecstasy and terror, wonder and loss, and an invitation to join him. For a moment I was tempted. The knowledge being offered was intoxicating, the promise of understanding the true nature of reality almost irresistible. But I thought of my family, my life, all the other searchers still doing their job in these woods. Someone needed to remember, to understand enough to warn others without understanding so much that they couldn't return. The entity recognized my decision. Reality rippled around me, and I found myself back at the trailhead. My equipment was gone, and my watch was working again, showing 3 days had passed. In my pocket was a single page from Blackwood's journal, covered in symbols I could no longer quite understand. The ability to comprehend them had been taken from me, a mercy that allowed me to retain my sanity. I retired from search and rescue work the following week, moved to Arizona, about as far from deep forests as I could get. I still wake up sometimes, my mind trying to wrap itself around memories it can't quite contain. The symbols appear in my dreams, but they're fading, becoming meaningless marks, rather than the reality-bending equations they once were. So why am I sharing this now? Because the 40-year cycle is nearly complete again. People will start disappearing in those woods soon, drawn by something they don't understand. If you're one of them, if you start seeing symbols that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them, if you feel reality becoming less solid around you, you have a choice to make. Some will choose to answer that invitation, to evolve beyond what we think of as human. But if you want to stay in this world, turn back, run. Don't look at the symbols. Don't try to understand them. And if you hear that vibration, the one that sounds like the space between dimensions opening, don't listen for meaning in it, because once you understand what it's saying, you'll never be able to stop hearing it, just like Dave never did, just like I never have. The call came in just as I was about to clock out for the day. A kid gone missing in Whispering Pines National Forest. Parents were those new age free-range types, the kind that lets their kids wander off like feral cats. Said their boy Lucas had become obsessed with some abandoned fire lookout tower deep in the woods. Figures. My name's Alex Reeves. I've been with Search and Rescue for the U.S. Forest Service going on 15 years now. In that time, I've seen it all. Lost hikers, reckless thrill seekers, the occasional animal attack. But this had my gut churning from the get-go. We rolled out just as the sun was dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My team consisted of 2 other rangers, Sarah Chen, a level-headed veteran with a knack for tracking, and Mike Donovan, an eager rookie with more enthusiasm than experience. The kids' parents met us at the trailhead, Mom a nervous wreck, Dad trying to mask his fear with an air of authority. They handed me a picture of Lucas, scrawny kid, about 10 years old, with ears that stuck out like jug handles and a bowl cut that screamed Mom's handiwork. Nothing remarkable about him, and that's what set my teeth on edge. In my experience, when an ordinary kid vanishes without a trace, it rarely ends well. Whispering Pines is old-growth forest, thick with towering redwoods and dense underbrush. As we started up the main trail, the fading light seemed to get swallowed by the canopy above. Sarah called out Lucas's name in that sing-songy voice they teach you in training, the one that's supposed to sound non-threatening but always makes my skin crawl. I hung back, my eyes scanning the deepening shadows. The weight of my Remington 870 shotgun was a comforting presence on my shoulder. I've learned the hard way not to let hope cloud my judgment in situations like these. Night fell fast, like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the world. We switched on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness like knives. The forest seemed to come alive around us, every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig amplified in the stillness. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong, something big moving through the underbrush just beyond the reach of our lights. "Lucas!" Sarah called out, her voice tinged with a mix of hope and apprehension. "It's the forest rangers. We're here to help you." More rustling, closer this time. I quietly flicked off the safety on my shotgun. Mike swung his flashlight toward the source of the noise, and for a split second I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the light. Yellow, predatory, and decidedly not human. "Too big for a coyote," I muttered, "but too small for a bear. Keep your lights on it." The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. And then, whatever it was stood up. God help me, it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. It was tall, unnaturally so, hunched over like a man, but all wrong. Its legs were too long, arms hanging almost to the ground. The skin, what I could see of it, was pale and hairless, like some cave-dwelling fish that had never seen the sun. The thing took a halting step forward, and I got a clear look at its face. The nose was flat, almost non-existent, with a jutting jaw full of teeth. Too many teeth. But it was the eyes that froze the blood in my veins. They were like black marbles, with just the barest sliver of white around the edges. "What the hell?" Mike's voice was barely above a whisper, thick with fear. The creature let out a sound, a high-pitched hiss like steam escaping a pressure valve, and charged. I raised my shotgun, the stock firm against my shoulder, and fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the forest. The thing staggered but kept coming, moving with an unnatural, loping gait. It was almost on top of Mike before he managed to get his own weapon up. The second blast caught the creature square in the chest. Bits of something flew in all directions. The thing let out a shriek that set my teeth on edge, a sound no earthly creature should be able to make, and lurched back into the darkness. "Holy shit," Sarah breathed, her usual composure shattered. "Lucas!" Mike roared into the night. "Lucas, can you hear us?" Silence. just the echo of the gunshots fading among the trees and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. We searched all night, combing every inch of that God-forsaken stretch of forest. We found nothing, no trace of Lucas, no sign of that thing. It was like the darkness had swallowed them both whole. By morning, reinforcements arrived. Deputies from the county sheriff's office, more rangers, even a couple of FBI agents. They questioned us for hours, taking detailed statements, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe us, not really, how could they? I barely believed it myself, and I'd been there. They never did find Lucas. Oh, there were theories. Rumors about some undiscovered species of animal, whispers of a deranged hermit living off the grid. But I knew the truth. I'd seen that thing's face, seen the cold intelligence, the hatred in those eyes. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely. Some experiences change you fundamentally. They alter the way you see the world, the way you move through it. After that night in Whispering Pines, I couldn't look at the forest the same way. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. I'd catch myself jumping at every unexpected sound, my hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. I stuck it out for another year, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. One moonless night I was driving a lonely stretch of back road when something darted in front of my headlights, a large, hunched figure loping across the asphalt. For one heart-stopping moment, I was back in that forest, face to face with the unthinkable. Then reality reasserted itself. It was just a coyote, slinking away into the underbrush. But the damage was done. I pulled over to the side of the road, killed the engine, and sat there in the dark, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. That's when I knew it was time to walk away. I turned in my resignation a week later. Never told anyone the full story, not my wife, not my therapist. They wouldn't understand. Hell, I'm not sure I understand it myself. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that unearthly shriek echoing in my dreams. And I can't help but wonder, is it still out there, hunting? Or am I the one who got away? The forest keeps its secrets. And some mysteries are better left unsolved. Or so I thought. 5 years after I left the Forest Service, I was working as a private investigator in the city. It wasn't the same as being out in the wilderness, but it kept food on the table and gave me a sense of purpose. I specialized in missing persons cases. Maybe it was my way of atoning for Lucas, the boy we never found. It was a crisp autumn morning when she walked into my office. Mid-40s, well-dressed, with the kind of haunted look in her eyes that I knew all too well. She introduced herself as Emily Thornton. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need your help. It's about my daughter, Abigail. She's gone missing." I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Thornton. When and where did this happen?" She hesitated, twisting a tissue in her hands. 3 days ago. We were camping in Whispering Pines National Forest. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Whispering Pines. The name alone was enough to send a chill down my spine. I must have visibly reacted because Emily leaned forward, her eyes searching my face. "You know something, don't you?" she asked. "Please, I've been to the police, the park rangers. No one will tell me anything, but I saw something out there. Something that shouldn't exist." I closed my eyes, took a deep breath. When I opened them, Emily was still there, still waiting. I made a decision. "Mrs. Thornton," I said, "I'm going to tell you a story about a boy named Lucas, and a night 5 years ago that changed my life forever." Over the next hour, I told her everything. The search for Lucas, the creature in the woods, the fruitless investigation that followed. To her credit, Emily didn't interrupt, didn't scoff or call me crazy. When I finished, she simply nodded. "That's what took my Abigail," she said with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. I saw it just for a moment. Tall, pale, wrong, I thought I was losing my mind. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Mrs. Thornton, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this job. What you're describing, it's dangerous. More dangerous than you can imagine. Emily's eyes flashed with a fierce determination. Mr. Reeves, you're the only person who's even acknowledged that this thing might exist. I don't care about the danger. I want my daughter back. I knew I should say no. I knew I should refer her to someone else, anyone else. But the memory of Lucas's face in that old photograph haunted me. The thought of another child lost in those woods, at the mercy of that thing. I couldn't walk away, not again. All right, I said, already regretting the words as they left my mouth. I'll take the case, but we do this my way. No risks, no heroics. And you need to be prepared for the possibility that we might not find Abigail. Emily nodded, relief and gratitude washing over her face. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Thank you. As she left my office, I pulled open my bottom desk drawer. Inside, nestled in a bed of old papers, was my old service revolver. I hadn't touched it in years, but my hand closed around the grip like it was yesterday. I had a lot of preparations to make, equipment to gather, contacts to call. But first I needed to make a pilgrimage, to the place where it all began. The next morning found me standing at the edge of Whispering Pines National Forest. The trees loomed before me, ancient and indifferent. Somewhere in those depths, a monster lurked, and I was about to walk right back into its lair. As I shouldered my pack and took my first step onto the trail, a thought occurred to me. Maybe I wasn't hunting this thing. Maybe all these years it had been waiting for me to return. Maybe I was the one being hunted. I pushed the thought aside and pressed on. Whatever awaited me in the heart of Whispering Pines, I was determined to face it. For Abigail, for Lucas, and for the part of myself I'd left behind in these woods 5 years ago. The forest swallowed me whole, and my journey into darkness began. The first few days of the search were uneventful, almost disappointingly so. I retraced the steps from 5 years ago, visited the site where we'd encountered the creature. Nothing. No signs of Abigail, no strange tracks, no eerie feelings of being watched. Just the quiet, indifferent forest. Emily had insisted on coming along despite my objections. She was tougher than she looked, keeping up with my pace and never complaining about the long hours or rough conditions. But I could see the toll it was taking on her, the hope in her eyes dimming a little more each day. On the fourth night, as we sat around a small campfire, Emily finally broke her silence. "Tell me about Lucas," she said softly. "The boy from your story. What was he like?" I poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. I never knew him, not really. Just a picture and a worried parent's description. But he seemed ordinary. The kind of kid you'd see in any suburban neighborhood, riding his bike or playing video games. Emily nodded, her eyes distant. Abigail's like that too. Smart, but not exceptionally so. Pretty, but not in a way that turns heads. She blends in. Something about the way she said it made me look up. "You think that's significant?" She shrugged. "I don't know, but I've been thinking. What if that's why they were taken? Because they're forgettable. The kind of children who might slip through the cracks." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Before I could respond, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond our campfire. Both of us froze, straining our ears. For a long moment there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the ambient sounds of the forest at night. Then we heard it. A low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and that steam hiss I remembered from years ago. I was on my feet in an instant, my revolver in hand. "Get behind me!" I hissed to Emily. She complied without a word, her eyes wide with fear, and was that anticipation? The sound came again, closer this time. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, the beam cutting through the inky blackness between the trees. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something pale and elongated darting between two massive trunks. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're armed. Identify yourself." Silence. Complete and absolute. Even the normal nighttime sounds of the forest had ceased, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Then, from directly behind us, came a voice that turned my blood to ice. "Mommy! Daddy, is that you?" It was a child's voice, high and sweet. But there was something off about it, a hollowness that made my skin crawl. Emily gasped, spinning around. "Abigail?" she cried. "Abby, honey, is that you?" I grabbed her arm before she could run off into the darkness. "Wait," I warned. "Something's not right." The voice came again, this time from our left. "Why did you leave me, Mommy? Don't you love me anymore?" Emily struggled against my grip. "Let me go! That's my daughter!" I held firm. "Mrs. Thornton, listen to me. That's not Abigail. Whatever's out there, it's trying to lure us away from the fire, away from safety." As if to prove my point, the voice shifted again, now coming from the right. But this time it had changed. Deeper, raspier, with an undercurrent of malice that made my hair stand on end. "Alex Reeves," it growled. "The one who got away. Did you miss me?" I raised my gun, my hands shaking slightly. "Show yourself," I demanded. A low chuckle echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "All in good time, Alex. All in good time. But first, a little game. You have until dawn to find the girl. If you don't, well, let's just say she'll have some company in the dark." The voice faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost deafening. Emily sagged against me, her face pale in the firelight. What was that?" she whispered. I holstered my gun, my mind racing. That, Mrs. Thornton, was our monster. And it's just changed the rules of the game. As the first hints of pre-dawn light began to creep through the canopy, we frantically searched the area around our campsite. Every shadow, every hollow tree, every dense patch of underbrush was scrutinized. But Abigail, if she was even here, remained frustratingly out of reach. Emily's desperation grew with each passing minute. "We have to find her," she cried, her voice hoarse from hours of calling her daughter's name. "It said we only have until dawn." I was about to respond when something caught my eye, a flash of pale fabric among the dark green of the forest floor. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pushed aside a cluster of ferns, I revealed a small backpack, dirty and torn, but unmistakably a child's school bag. Emily gasped. "That's Abby's. She had it with her when... I held up a hand, silencing her. There, in the soft earth next to the backpack, was a footprint. But not a child's print, nor an adult human's. This was elongated, with strange protrusions where toes should be, and it was fresh. "We're close," I whispered. "Very close. But we need to be careful. This thing is smart and it's playing with us." As if in response to my words, a high-pitched giggle echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of something large moving quickly through the underbrush. Without thinking, I took off after it, Emily close on my heels. We crashed through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. The sounds always seemed just ahead, leading us deeper and deeper into uncharted territory. As we ran, the trees began to thin out, and I realized with a start that we were approaching the edge of a cliff. Suddenly, the noises stopped. We skidded to a halt at the cliff's edge, panting heavily. Before us stretched a vast canyon, its far side obscured by tendrils of mist in the early morning light. And there, perched precariously on a narrow ledge about 20 feet below us, was a small figure. "Abigail!" Emily screamed, lurching forward. I grabbed her just in time, pulling her back from the edge, The figure turned and I felt my blood run cold. It looked like Abigail, same size, same long dark hair, but something was off. Its movements were too fluid, too precise. And its eyes were solid black, reflecting the growing dawn like polished obsidian. "Well done," it said, in a voice that was an unsettling mix of child and adult, human and other. "You found me, but the question is, what are you willing to do to save her?" As it spoke, the thing's form seemed to ripple and shift. One moment it was Abigail. The next it was the pale, elongated creature I remembered from 5 years ago. Back and forth it flickered, as if it couldn't decide which form to settle on. "Where is my daughter?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. The creature tilted its head, an eerily human gesture. "Closer than you think, and further than you can imagine. She's in the in-between, just like all the others. Lucas says hello, by the way." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "Lucas? He's alive?" A sound that might have been a laugh escaped the creature's lipless mouth. "Alive? Dead? Such limited concepts you humans have. They exist in a place beyond your understanding, but they can be returned for a price." "Name it," Emily said immediately. I tried to caution her, but she shrugged off my hand. "Whatever it is, I'll pay it. Just give me back my daughter." The creature's form solidified, settling into its true, nightmarish shape. It stood to its full height, easily 7 feet tall, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. When it smiled, rows of needle-sharp teeth gleamed in the growing light. "The price," it said slowly, savoring each word, "is a life for a life. One of you stays and the girl goes free. Decide quickly. The dawn is almost here." Emily stepped forward without hesitation. "Take me. Let Abigail go." "No," I shouted, grabbing her arm. "You don't know what you're agreeing to. This thing, it's not to be trusted." The creature's grin widened. "Wise words, Alex Reeves. But what other choice do you have? The sun rises, and with it your chance slips away." I looked at Emily, saw the determination in her eyes. Then I thought of Lucas, of all the children who had vanished in these woods over the years, of the nightmares that had haunted me since that night 5 years ago. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. "Take me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm the one you've been waiting for, aren't I? Ever since I escaped that night. Take me, and let both Abigail and Emily go." The creature's eyes widened slightly, the first sign of surprise I'd seen from it. "Interesting," it mused. "Very interesting. Are you sure about this, Alex? There's no coming back from where I'll take you." I swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'm sure, but I want to see Abigail first. Prove to me she's alive and unharmed." For a long moment the creature regarded me silently. Then, with a gesture that was almost gentle, it reached into the mist swirling around the ledge. When its hand emerged, it was holding the limp form of a young girl. "Abby!" Emily cried, surging forward. The creature held up its other hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Not yet," it said. "The exchange must be made properly." It turned its unsettling gaze back to me. "Come, Alex Reeves. Your journey into the in-between begins now." As I stepped toward the edge of the cliff, time seemed to slow. I heard Emily's anguished cry, felt the cold mist curling around my ankles. The creature reached out its free hand, those impossibly long fingers beckoning. Just before I took that final step, I turned to Emily. "Get Abigail out of here," I said, "and tell the world what happened. Make them believe." Then I clasped the creature's hand, felt a jolt of otherworldly cold race up my arm. As the world began to fade around me, I saw Abigail's eyes flutter open. The last thing I heard before the mist consumed me was her confused voice. "Mommy? Where am I?" And then, nothing. Or perhaps everything. I found myself in a place beyond description, a realm where reality bent and twisted like a living thing. And I wasn't alone. All around me I sensed the presence of others, lost souls trapped between worlds. Somewhere in this impossible space, Lucas was waiting. My hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. As for Emily and Abigail, I like to think they made it out of Whispering Pines alive, that they told their story, even if no one believed them. And maybe, just maybe, they'll inspire someone else to look deeper into the shadows, to question the things that lurk at the edges of our world. Because the monsters are real, and sometimes the only way to fight them is to become one yourself. My name is Ryan Morales, and I'm about to tell you a story that will change the way you see the world. It's not a tale for the faint of heart, but it's one that needs to be told. This is my account of the events that unfolded on July 22, 2001, deep in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains. I was 28 years old then, born and raised in the rolling hills of Tennessee. My blood ran thick with the ways of the woodsman, passed down through generations. But on that fateful day, I learned that the skills I'd honed tracking deer and wild turkey were woefully inadequate for the prey I'd soon face. Our team had been dispatched to investigate a series of disturbing incidents in a remote area of the Smokies. Locals were whispering about something stalking the forests, something that left mangled livestock and missing hikers in its wake. Most folks would dismiss such tales as campfire stories, but we knew better. We were part of a clandestine organization tasked with handling threats that most of the world doesn't even know exist. As we loaded our gear into the rugged SUVs, I caught the eye of my partner, Sarah Hayes. She gave me a grim nod, her fingers unconsciously brushing the stock of her rifle. "You ready for this, Morales?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. I forced a smile. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, trying to ignore the knot of dread forming in my stomach. Our 5-person team consisted of seasoned operatives, each with their own specialty. Besides Hayes and myself, we had Jack Reynolds, a hulking ex-Marine with nerves of steel, Dr. Eliza Chen, our resident cryptozoologist, and Tom Knox, our tech expert whose array of gadgets often seemed more science fiction than fact. The drive into the mountains was tense, filled with last-minute equipment checks and hushed conversations about our mission parameters. As we climbed higher into the misty peaks, the modern world fell away, replaced by an ancient landscape that seemed to harbor secrets in every shadow. We set up our base camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that creaked and groaned in the wind. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As night fell, an eerie stillness descended upon the forest, broken only by the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Our first few days of investigation yielded little. We combed the area, following up on local reports and setting up motion-activated cameras. The nights were the worst, filled with strange noises that set our nerves on edge. More than once I caught myself reaching for my weapon, only to realize it was just a deer moving through the underbrush. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream that cut through the darkness like a knife. Grabbing my rifle, I burst out of my tent to find chaos erupting around me. Reynolds was gone, his sleeping bag torn to shreds. Knox was frantically trying to get a signal on our satellite phone, while Chen huddled near the dying embers of our fire, her face ashen with fear. Hayes appeared at my side, her eyes wild. "Did you see it?" she hissed, scanning the tree line. I shook my head, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear myself think. No, but whatever it was, it took Reynolds without a sound. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, backs to each other, weapons at the ready. As dawn broke, we began a desperate search for our missing comrade. Hours passed with no sign of Reynolds, save for a few broken branches and what looked disturbingly like claw marks gouged deep into tree trunks. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to close in around us. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through our systems. Hayes was chain-smoking, her hands shaking as she lit each cigarette. Knox's usual cocky demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that had him jumping at shadows. It was nearing dusk when disaster struck again. We were making our way back to camp when a hidden tripwire sent our ATV careening down a steep ravine. Knox, who had been driving, let out a cry of pain as his leg was crushed beneath the overturned vehicle. As we rushed to his aid, that's when I saw it. The creature emerged from behind a cluster of gnarled trees, its massive form dwarfing everything around it. Standing at least 8 feet tall, it had the build of a linebacker gone feral, with mottled gray skin that looked as tough as old leather. But it was the face that seared itself into my nightmares. A elongated, almost canine muzzle filled with razor-sharp teeth, and eyes that glowed with an unholy amber light. For a split second, we all froze, our minds struggling to process the impossible sight before us. Then training kicked in, and we opened fire. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire as we unloaded round after round into the beast. It howled in pain and fury, a sound that shook the very ground beneath our feet. But our bullets seemed to have little effect, the wounds closing almost as quickly as they appeared. In a blur of motion, the creature was upon us. Hayes let out a strangled cry as its claws raked across her back, lifting her off her feet and tossing her aside like a rag doll. I watched in horror as she crumpled to the ground, unmoving. Rage and fear battled within me as I emptied my rifle into the monster's chest. Black ichor sprayed from the wounds, but it kept coming, its eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. I stumbled backward, fumbling to reload, knowing with sickening certainty that I was about to die. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Knox, get clear!" A blinding flash of blue-white light erupted from the tree line, accompanied by a crackling hum that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The beam struck the creature squarely in the chest, sending it reeling backward with an ear-splitting shriek. More beams lanced out from the darkness, pinning the beast in place as it thrashed and roared. I scrambled away, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. From the corner of my eye, I saw figures emerging from the trees, clad in black tactical gear and wielding weapons that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. The creature made one last, desperate lunge before collapsing to the ground, its unnatural vitality finally spent. As the echoes of its final roar faded away, an eerie silence fell over the forest. I stood there panting heavily, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. The newcomers moved with practiced efficiency, securing the creature and gathering evidence from the scene. One of them, a wiry man with hard, calculating eyes, approached me. "Special Agent Thorne," he said, extending his hand. "You handled yourself well under fire, Morales." I shook his hand numbly, still struggling to process everything that had happened. "Just doing my job," I managed to croak out. Thorne's lips quirked into a humorless smile. "Well, your job description just got a hell of a lot more complicated. Welcome to the real world." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Black unmarked vans arrived, along with a helicopter for emergency evacuation. Hayes was loaded onto a stretcher, her fate uncertain. Knox was tended to by a medical team, his leg splinted and stabilized. As dawn broke, Thorne pulled me aside. "We've been watching you, Morales," he said. "You've got the skills and the temperament we're looking for. I'm offering you a chance to join us, to fight the battles that most people don't even know are happening. It won't be easy, and there's no going back to your old life, but you'll be making a difference in ways you can't even imagine." I thought about Reynolds, vanished without a trace, about Hayes, her blood staining the forest floor, about the creature that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. And I realized that I couldn't walk away, couldn't pretend that I hadn't seen what I'd seen. "I'm in," I said, sealing my fate with 2 simple words. The years that followed were a crash course in a hidden world of nightmares and wonders. I learned about creatures that lurked in the deepest oceans and the highest mountain peaks. I trained with weapons and technology that pushed the boundaries of what I thought possible. And I fought alongside men and women who had dedicated their lives to keeping the rest of the world safe from threats they could never comprehend. But with each mission, each encounter with the impossible, I felt a piece of my old self slipping away. The weight of secrecy, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that each day could be my last. It all took its toll. Now, as I sit here recounting this tale, I can't help but wonder about the price of knowledge. Is ignorance truly bliss? Or is there value in facing the darkness head-on, in standing as a bulwark between the innocent and the horrors that lurk just beyond their perception? I don't have all the answers, but I do know this. As long as there are things that go bump in the night, as long as there are shadows that threaten to engulf the light, I'll be there. Because someone has to stand on that front line. Someone has to fight the battles that history will never record. And maybe, just maybe, that someone is me. Years have passed since that fateful night in the Smoky Mountains, each one filled with encounters that would shatter most people's sanity. I've seen things that defy explanation, faced creatures that shouldn't exist, and lost more friends than I care to count. But I've also saved lives, protected the innocent, and pushed back against the darkness that threatens to engulf our world. One mission in particular stands out in my mind, a hunt that took us to the icy wilderness of Alaska. We'd received reports of a massive creature terrorizing remote fishing villages along the coast. Locals spoke of an ancient beast, a serpent-like monstrosity that had been part of their legends for generations. Our team consisted of 5 operatives: myself, Dr. Chen, who had recovered from her injuries and become one of our top field researchers, a native Alaskan tracker named Akiak, our tech specialist Miranda Johnson, and a grizzled veteran named Carson who'd seen more action than the rest of us combined. We set up our base camp on the shores of a mist-shrouded lake, the water black and still as glass. The air was thick with tension and the biting cold of the Arctic night. For days we scoured the area, following leads and setting up surveillance equipment. But the creature remained elusive, leaving behind only fleeting glimpses on thermal cameras and the occasional scale the size of a dinner plate. It was on our 5th night that all hell broke loose. I was on watch, scanning the shoreline with night vision goggles when I saw it. A massive shape rising from the depths, water cascading off its serpentine body. It was easily 60 feet long, with a head like a crocodile's, and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intelligence. I sounded the alarm, and our camp erupted into action. Carson and Johnson manned our heavy weapons experimental sonic cannons, designed to disorient and subdue large cryptids. Dr. Chen rushed to set up our containment equipment, while Akiak and I took up flanking positions with high-powered rifles loaded with tranquilizer rounds potent enough to take down a blue whale. The battle that ensued was like something out of a fever dream. The creature moved with impossible speed for its size, lashing out with a spiked tail that could shatter boulders. Our weapons seemed to barely slow it down, the sonic blasts only serving to enrage it further. Akiak was the first to fall, swept aside by a massive flipper as he tried to get a clear shot. I watched in horror as Johnson, brave and brilliant Johnson, threw herself in front of me as the creature launched one of its barbed spines. The projectile caught her squarely in the chest, and I saw the light fade from her eyes even as she gave me one last determined smile. Grief and rage fueled me as I emptied my rifle into the beast's hide, each impact leaving welts the size of basketballs, but doing little to slow its rampage. Carson's sonic cannon finally found its mark, the focused sound waves causing the creature to writhe in agony. But as it thrashed, its tail caught Carson, sending him flying into the icy waters of the lake. In that moment, as I watched Carson disappear beneath the waves and heard Dr. Chen's desperate calls for backup, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I grabbed Johnson's fallen sonic cannon, cranked it to maximum power, and fired directly at the lake itself. The effect was catastrophic. The water's surface seemed to explode, sending shock waves rippling through the air. The creature let out a deafening shriek of pain and fury before plunging back into the depths, leaving behind a churning maelstrom of froth and blood. As silence fell over the battlefield, I rushed to the water's edge, searching desperately for any sign of Carson. But the lake had become his tomb, its dark waters hiding whatever fate had befallen him. In the aftermath, as we tended to our wounded and mourned our dead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only postponed an inevitable confrontation. The creature was wounded, yes, but not defeated. And the cost had been far too high. That mission marked a turning point for me. I realized that our war against the unknown wasn't just about survival or protecting the public. It was about finding a balance, about understanding these creatures even as we fought against them. Because for every mindless beast, there was an entity of ancient intelligence. For every predator, a being simply trying to exist in a world that had forgotten it. Over the years, I've risen through the ranks of our organization. I've gone from field operative to mission coordinator, and finally, to a position where I can influence policy and strategy. I've pushed for more research, for attempts at communication with the more intelligent cryptids, for solutions that don't always end in bloodshed. It hasn't been easy. There are those within the organization who see only threats to be eliminated, who would weaponize the very creatures we hunt. But I've also found allies, scientists, diplomats, and even a few reformed cryptids who have chosen to work with us rather than against us. Today, as I look out over the training grounds where a new generation of hunters is being prepared for the battles to come, I feel a mix of pride and trepidation. Pride in how far we've come, in the lives we've saved and the understanding we've gained. But trepidation at the knowledge that our war is far from over. The world is changing. The shadows are growing deeper, and the barriers between our reality and others are becoming increasingly thin. New threats emerge every day, some from the darkest corners of our world, others from realms we're only beginning to understand. But we'll be ready. We'll face whatever comes with courage, wisdom, and the hope that one day we can build a world where humans and cryptids can coexist in peace. It's a fool's hope, perhaps, but it's what keeps me going, what gives meaning to the sacrifices we've made. As for me, I know my days in the field are numbered. The scars I carry, both physical and mental, are a constant reminder of the toll this life takes. But as long as I'm able, I'll keep fighting. I'll keep pushing for a better way. Because someone has to. Someone has to stand on that line between light and darkness, between the known and the unimaginable. And that someone, well, that someone is still me. The year was 2009, but the woods had been there long before. They stood across from our house like a green wall, dense with cedar and oak, promising secrets to anyone brave enough to cross the threshold. I was 13 when we moved to that neighborhood, already carrying the weight of being the outsider, the fresh meat for the local predators that prowled the school hallways. Home wasn't much better. The walls seemed to absorb every argument, every slammed door, every silent treatment, until they radiated tension like heat. My parents existed in a state of Cold War, using me as their unwilling messenger, their emotional punching bag. The few other kids in the neighborhood were older, meaner, already versed in the casual cruelty that comes with adolescence. I remember the first time I fled into those woods. It was after Tommy McKenzie had decided that my face needed rearranging. I ran until my lungs burned, until the sound of his laughter faded behind me. The trees closed around me like protective arms, branches catching at my clothes as if trying to hold me back, keep me safe. That's when I found it, my sanctuary, a perfect circle of cedar trees, their branches interlaced overhead to create a natural dome. Filtered sunlight dappled the ground through gaps in the canopy, creating patterns that seemed to move and shift with each breath of wind. It was like stumbling into a fairy tale, finding a place that existed outside the brutal reality of my daily life. The first time I fell asleep, there was an accident. I'd been reading, propped against one of the cedars, letting the peaceful silence wash over me. When I opened my eyes, stars were visible through the gaps in the branches. Terror gripped me. Surely my parents would be frantic, would have called the police, would punish me forever. But when I crept home, heart pounding, nothing had changed. No police cars, no frantic parents, no search parties. My mother was passed out on the couch, TV flickering in the dark room. My father's truck wasn't in the driveway. They hadn't even noticed I was gone. That knowledge changed something in me. If they didn't care enough to notice my absence, why shouldn't I make the woods my real home? The Army surplus store sat on the edge of town like a forgotten relic, its windows dusty with age and neglect. I'd saved every dollar from my makeshift lawn care business, hiding the crumpled bills inside a hollow tree in my cedar sanctuary. Each lawn had been a battle, stealing my father's mower in the pre-dawn hours, returning it before he woke, enduring suspicious looks from neighbors who couldn't quite place where they knew me from. The beating I took when he finally caught me was worth it. I'd saved enough by then to buy my own rusted push mower from a yard sale, and more importantly, I had enough for what I really needed: camping gear. The store's interior smelled of mothballs and old canvas. Behind the counter, a Vietnam vet with nicotine-stained fingers watched me suspiciously as I wandered the aisles. The Alice pack I chose was olive drab, probably older than I was, its straps worn smooth by unknown hands. Into it went the essentials of my new life: a surplus sleeping bag, a canvas tarp, rope, matches in waterproof containers, a canteen, and various other items that promised survival. My hands trembled with excitement as I laid everything on the counter. The old vet's eyes softened somewhat as he rang up my purchases. "Running away, kid?" he asked, not unkindly. "No, sir," I lied. "Just camping." He nodded, though I could tell he didn't believe me. As he bagged my items, he threw in a free compass and a book on wilderness survival. "Be careful out there," he said. "The woods ain't always friendly." If only I'd understood then just how prophetic those words would prove to be. School became an afterthought, a necessary evil to be endured just enough to avoid official attention. I learned more in those woods than I ever did in a classroom. The cedars taught me about patience, about the slow turning of seasons. The creek showed me how life flows always forward, never back. The animals, squirrels, rabbits, the occasional deer taught me about awareness, about moving quietly through the world. My sanctuary evolved. The tarp became a semi-permanent roof, carefully strung to shed rain. I dug a small fire pit, lining it with stones from the creek. A cache of dry wood stayed protected under a smaller tarp. My sleeping bag rested on a bed of pine needles gathered from beyond my territory. This wasn't camping anymore. This was living. The woods became my kingdom, and I its sole guardian. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig registered in my consciousness. I knew the normal sounds of my domain as intimately as a mother knows her child's breathing. Which is why that Sunday afternoon I recognized the wrongness immediately. The camper squatted by the creek like a tumor, its dirty white sides reflecting the afternoon sun. Two men moved around it with the restless energy of methamphetamine, their movements jerky and purposeless. Beer cans littered the ground around them. The crack of gunfire echoed through my woods as they shot at nothing in particular, laughing with each report. I watched them from my hidden position, rage building in my chest. These were invaders, desecrators. When a stray bullet struck the water near where I collected my drinking supply, something snapped inside me. The woods weren't just my sanctuary anymore, they were my responsibility. The call to the sheriff was made from our home phone, my voice disguised as best I could manage. I spun a tale of threats and menace, painting the men as the monsters I believed them to be. It never occurred to me then that I was crossing a line, that my words would have consequences that would echo through decades. The news report crackled through our kitchen radio one morning as I prepared for another day of minimal school attendance. Acting on an anonymous tip, sheriff's deputies discovered a mobile methamphetamine laboratory. The words froze me in place, half-eaten toast forgotten in my hand. The report continued, detailing how 2 men had been arrested, their makeshift lab seized. Pride mingled with fear in my chest. I had done this. I had protected my woods. But as the magnitude of what I'd set in motion began to sink in, that pride curdled into something darker. These weren't just random troublemakers. They were serious criminals. And I had put them away. For months, I followed their case through newspaper clippings I collected and stored in a waterproof container in my sanctuary. Each new development brought fresh waves of anxiety and relief. They were being held without bail. They had prior convictions. The evidence was overwhelming. Then the first letter arrived. The envelope was unremarkable, just my name and address in cramped handwriting. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained 5 words. "We know it was you, kid." Ice replaced the blood in my veins. Questions flooded my mind. How had they found out? Who else knew? What would they do? The woods, my sanctuary, suddenly felt exposed. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every rustle of leaves could be footsteps. The second letter was worse. "You better pray we get time served." They kept coming, each one more explicit than the last. I began intercepting the mail before my parents could see it, racing home from school to beat them to the mailbox. Sleep became impossible without the protective embrace of my cedar grove. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now hiding in the woods from the very threat the woods had helped me create. The day of their sentencing arrived like a funeral. I watched the courthouse from across the street, hidden in plain sight among the other spectators. 20 years. The judge's words echoed in my head like a death knell. 20 years for 2 men who now knew exactly who had put them there. The letters stopped after that, but the damage was done. Every unexpected sound made me jump. Every stranger's face could be a friend or family member of the convicted men, coming to exact revenge. I retreated deeper into my woodland fortress, but even there, peace eluded me. Time passed, as it always does. I grew up, moved away, built a life. The woods became a memory, albeit one that visited my dreams regularly. I went to college, met someone, fell in love. We had a child. Normal life stuff. The kind of things that make you think you've outrun your past. I never told anyone about those days, about the letters, about the fear. How could I explain that my entire adolescence had been shaped by a single phone call, that somewhere out there, 2 men were marking time until they could seek revenge? The years dulled the edge of my fear, turned it into something almost nostalgic. Almost. The new letter arrived last week. Plain envelope, no return address, just like before. Inside, 6 words that shattered my carefully constructed peace. "You better write a will. Time's up." My girlfriend saw me drop it, saw the color drain from my face. I played it off as a prank, but the fear was back, fresher and sharper than ever. Because now I had something to lose, someone to lose, multiple someones. Every car that drives past our apartment too slowly could be them. Every unknown number that calls could be them. Every shadow in our baby's room could be them. The woods protected me once, but I'm not hidden anymore. I'm exposed, vulnerable, marked. Writing this now, I understand something I couldn't grasp as that angry, scared 13-year-old. Actions have consequences that stretch far beyond our ability to see. Those men deserved prison. They were cooking meth, shooting guns while high, endangering everyone around them. But my lie about them threatening me directly? That was the poison pill that's been slowly killing me for 12 years. I check the locks constantly now. I've installed cameras, motion sensors, alarms. My girlfriend thinks I'm being paranoid about break-ins, and I let her think that. How can I tell her that two men who've spent the last 20 years plotting revenge might be coming for us? How can I explain that my childhood sanctuary in the woods led to this moment? The police aren't an option. What would I tell them? That 20 years ago, I made a partially false report that put two meth dealers in prison, and now I'm getting threatening letters. They'd tell me to call them if something actually happens. By then, it might be too late, so I write this as a confession, a warning, and maybe a plea for help. Somewhere out there, two men have just been released from prison. They've had 20 years to plan what they'll do to the kid who put them there. 20 years to let their anger ferment into something monstrous. The woods protected me once, but I'm not in the woods anymore, and there's nowhere left to hide. To anyone reading this, be careful of the choices you make as a child. They don't stay in childhood. They follow you, growing stronger in the dark like poison ivy, until one day they emerge to strangle everything you've built. And to those two men, if you're reading this, I was just a scared kid trying to protect the only safe place I had. The lie about the threats was wrong, I know that now. But you were there, shooting guns while high, cooking meth near where children could find it. Whatever you're planning, remember that I'm not that helpless kid anymore. The woods taught me patience. They taught me awareness. They taught me survival. Pray you don't make me use those lessons.